Now in public session. So may I welcome members and also viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the 11th public session of the joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. And before I introduce our witnesses, at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched onto flight mode. So I'd like to extend on behalf of the committee a warm welcome to Mr Tom Donlan, Chief Executive Officer of Bord na Móna, and he's joined today by Mr John Riley, Charles Shear and Anne-Marie Curry. So I just want to proceed with some formal proceedings first, formalities. So I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. So I'd now like to call on Mr Tom Donlan to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Seán Sherlock, and to the committee for the invitation to speak here today. Bord na Móna has been the focus of a large amount of public comment in the past few weeks, and it is both timely and appropriate that we assist in the national response regarding climate action and outline our decarbonisation plans. When it was founded, Bord na Móna was given a mandate to support Irish energy security and employment in the Midlands. That mandate to support employment is as important to us now as it was then. For Bord na Móna, decarbonisation presents both a serious challenge and a considerable opportunity. It means moving away from peat into renewables, into resource recovery and new businesses that all support the key national policies. We are keenly aware of the effect this transition is having on our people, who are the group most affected by decarbonisation. The company plan essentially involves three parts. The first part involves consolidating and simplifying our business structures so that we can decarbonise and reposition Bord na Móna. The second part involves accelerating plans and development of a renewable energy and a resource recovery business. The third is the development of new sustainable businesses to support significant employment. The first part of this plan is aimed at providing a new structure that takes account of the need to decarbonise the businesses and deliver a new Bord na Móna. The new structure safeguards the maximum number of jobs and facilitates the decarbonisation strategy. As the committee is aware, decarbonising our business has meant us confronting some extremely difficult choices. On the 24th of October, we announced that fewer people will be working in our peat operations and also in our managerial and administrative roles across Bord na Móna. We also announced that we would open a voluntary redundancy programme with the expectation that these changes could directly impact approximately 380 to 430 roles and employees. This wasn't an easy decision to make. We have taken these steps to allow us to decarbonise and at the same time save the company so it will continue to be a vehicle for economic growth in the Midlands, a role that is very important given the challenging socio-economic profile of the region. Doing this will enable us to implement national policy, including the achievement of climate action policy. I have met with employees and spoke at 11 town hall meetings in the past few weeks, and the employees believe the decision is supported by the vast majority number of the workforce. A consultation process that includes the group of unions is underway. We have recently internally advertised new roles to implement the new structure and have received a high level of interest. In addition, we have a range of retraining and reskilling opportunities that we will be making available to our employees who are affected by this process, and part of that is in the appendix that we have shared with you. I am confident that we will meet the challenge of decarbonisation in a fair and measured way. This is all part of the managed transition out of peat and acceleration into renewable energy, resource recovery and low-carbon sustainable business. This managed transition is in line with key aspects of national policy. A managed transition is in line with national planning framework, which outlines the government's high-level strategic plan for shaping the future growth and development of the country out to 2040. A managed transition is also in line with the Citizens' Assembly proposals, where 97% of the members recommended that the state should end all subsidies for peat extraction and instead spend that money on peat bog restoration. The Assembly also said there should be a proper provision for the protection of the rights of the workers impacted, with the majority, 61%, recommending that the state should end all subsidies on a phased basis over 5 years. The PSO subsidies for peat fire generation ended 3 years ago in the case of Bornamona's Heydon Dairy Power Station and will cease completely in the ESB stations next year. The company notes that there has been many calls for similar funds to support the transition in line with the Citizens' Assembly recommendation. As the committee is aware, Bornamona-owned Heydon Dairy Power Station is co-fired with biomass for a number of years. 70% of this biomass is sourced in Ireland. Co-firing with biomass, which is renewable, greenhouse gas neutral and sustainably sourced, makes Heydon Dairy Power Station one of the largest single providers of renewable energy in the island of Ireland. We expect that the future requirement for biomass will grow from over 400,000 energy tonnes this year to in excess of 1.3 million energy tonnes per annum in circa 2020-2021. 70% of our current supply is sourced in Ireland, and our preference at all times is to source Irish biomass material. As supplies of Irish biomass are currently limited, we are working to develop sustainable imports and indigenous supply chains to meet these increasing demands. A key part of the managed transition will take place during the next 12 months when we begin to reduce the supply of peat and begin supplying biomass to ESB's 2 mainland-based power stations. This will have the immediate effect of significantly cutting the carbon emissions for these stations. This part of the transition is of course subject to the ESB successfully progressing planning applications for their West Offaly and Loughree power stations, which we believe will be submitted shortly to An Bord Pleanála and to Longford County Council. The end of this transition period will occur in the region of 2027-2028, where the intention is for these stations to run 100% biomass. The 3 stations running on biomass will potentially provide 346 megawatt of dispatchable renewable power to the Irish grid. The progressive replacement of peat with biomass will allow for those people affected by the current plan to be treated in a fair and just manner. The transition is a relatively short period of time and will allow for the significant number of people to retire in that time, or, in cases, allow them to avail of replacement employment opportunities within the company where they become available, or retain or reskill for alternative employment outside the company. It will also allow the company to build out new sustainable businesses that we intend to become a new foundation stone for employment and for communities in the Midlands. In terms of reduction in the amount of carbon, the result of this managed transition will be very significant. From a baseline of peat emissions of 3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide in 2015, Bornamona estimates that it will reduce its peat product emissions to 1.8 million tonnes in 2020. This is a reduction of 40% in CO2 emissions by 2020 alone. Bornamona has made considerable progress in decarbonising electricity, with the carbon intensity falling from 1.1 tonnes of CO2 per megawatt hour in 2007 to 0.5 tonnes today, and likely to fall to 0.16 tonnes by 2025. Bornamona's renewable electricity is currently produced at Drehead Landfill Gas, Mount Lucas Wind Farm, Brucana Wind Farm, Sliabone Joint Venture Wind Farm, and the country's first ever wind farm in Belcorrick in County Mayo and Heydon Dairy using biomass. The power generation business is a key driver of the group's strategy to transition to a sustainable future, with well over 60% of the electricity generated currently classified as renewable. As we accelerate decarbonisation, we will build on this solid platform, helping us to meet our objectives of becoming a leading generator of renewable energy as we expand development across our land bank. Bornamona's energy power station provides a unique, important role as a large-scale generator of dispatchable renewable power to the grid at a time of increasing intermittency of generation on the Irish grid system. I think it is important for the committee to note that the role of biomass will play in delivering dispatchable renewable power in the coming years. Bornamona is also in the process of developing a 172 megawatt Onini wind farm in North Mayo through a joint venture with ESB, which will become operational in 2019. Procurement for another wind farm in Cloncreen and Offaly is already progressing. We're also developing solar farms in partnership with ESB and have accelerated our plans for renewable energy deployment during the company's transition. This will involve the development of up to 2 gigawatt of generating assets by 2030. Investment in this area will support the creation of considerable numbers of long-term jobs, as well as providing construction jobs during the build-out programme. Perhaps even more importantly, the development of these renewable assets will help support other key parts of the transition journey, especially in the areas that will generate more significant employment opportunities in the Midlands. We have also invested significantly in engaging people and communities near renewable energy developments. This is consistent with our values and traditions as a company, which I believe will have a very positive effect on how these proposals are received and perceived during the planning, development and operational stages. Alongside the development of renewable energy supply, we are also increasingly active in the provision of virtual power plant services and demand-side management. To do this, Bornemona has acquired a 50% interest in a start-up company called Electricity Exchange, which focuses on the development of smart technologies and the provision of flexible support services to National Grid. This business supports high-tech Irish jobs and recently announced ambitious plans to expand in the future. Energy efficiency will also be at the centre of this transition to a clean, low-carbon energy system by 2050. In this context, Ireland's EU and national commitments are wider climate change goals. Bornemona, as a commercial semi-state, has worked towards achieving the national 33% target. Our resource recovery business is a key pillar in Bornemona's strategy, helping the company diversify away from carbon activities while supporting national waste policy. Bornemona is also involved in the waste-to-energy sphere as a landfill gas utilisation plant at Drogheda, which generates around 38,000 megawatt-hours of renewable energy per annum. We have also acquired the end-of-life tyre collection and processing service, Ireland's only recycling operation, which ensures complete destruction of car tyres and 98% recovery of material for recycling use. In addition, significant investment is being made in recovery technologies in the areas of plastic recycling. These existing resource recovery activities already support in excess of 300 jobs, with Bornemona, with an additional 50 being created in our tyre recycling facility in the Nore Road in Drogheda. Investment in higher value material and resource recovery we will believe help deliver a key national sustainable waste objectives, but also help support replacement employment in the Midlands. Bornemona is keenly conscious of how important it is for the company to go from brown to green strategy, and it is successful. This has been a feature of much of public commentary on our decision to decarbonise. Bornemona and our employees are setting out on a very challenging journey. We are aware that this will be a significant test case for public perception around climate action. If after we are finished and our transition is perceived as a success that benefit people nationally, then the national task of decarbonisation will be made immeasurably easier. If, however, climate action is perceived as entirely negative process that is a burden borne only by employees of companies like Bornemona and by already disadvantaged Midlands communities, then the national strategy would needlessly be undermined. This consideration is a key driver of our plans. As a company, we know we have to accelerate plans and demonstrate the real benefits that will occur as we move to new low-carbon businesses. These new business plans include projects that tap into our local land assets and the skills of our workforce. We have identified 2 areas of intent for new business, the first involving freshwater aquaculture and the second involved the supply of herbal remedies to the pharma and cosmetic sectors. Our aquaculture project is already being piloted as a closed-loop freshwater fish farm located in one of our bogs in East Offaly that we are progressing with the support of Bord Iascaigh Mhara. We are looking to progress this and the herbal business project to a business case in the next 12 to 18 months. Thereafter, we hopefully will be developing these as commercial ventures of scale. Bornemona is also looking at opportunities to develop the infrastructure and alternative fuel sources required for electric and other low-emissions vehicles. While HGVs account for only 3% of the total vehicles in Ireland, they consume 20% of the energy used within this fleet. Compressed natural gas has high potential to decarbonise HGVs due to the challenges associated with full electrification of them. To do this, the company is developing an anaerobic digestion and biomethane injection project in Culnamona in County Laois, which will contribute to the decarbonisation of natural gas network. Borden also has also identified potential rapid recharging sites for vehicles with its land bank and is assessing their suitability. All of these investments in this area also support the company's objectives of developing new Midlands-based employment that is sustainable and support the low-carbon economy. We are at an early stage of the development, but we estimate these projects carry with them the potential to grow Bordemona's employment base by approximately 500 people. This will be achieved in a way that supports a low-carbon economy generally, and also that can support economic development across the communities that we are so strongly associated with. I am encouraged by all the support that has been flagged on this, and if it is delivered, I believe we can help ensure that the Midlands is a big winner out of decarbonisation, a winner in terms of investment, cleaner air, water, better amenities, and of course better employment opportunities. Potential for job creation arising out of renewable power development, resource recovery and renewable businesses is significant. We have conservatively estimated and independently verified that this plan will create and support significant direct and indirect jobs during the coming decade. Importantly, these jobs will be sustainable and will support the green economy jobs, which will be based in the Midlands of Ireland. In achieving these objectives, we have been assisted with and are engaging with a range of bodies, including the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, a range of state agencies that include Enterprise Ireland, the IDA, Bord Iascaigh Mhara, and many Midlands local authorities who have been very proactive in the response to the company's transition needs. We will be also engaging with EU-based institutions regarding potential support that could be forthcoming there. I wish also to mention something about how this decarbonisation plan fits with our land use and our strategy. Our decarbonisation plan includes a significant investment in the rehabilitation and restoration of bogs. To date, more than 15% of the total land area of Bordemona's ownership has been rehabilitated and or restored in line with international, EU and national targets. Bog rehabilitation and restoration provides a range of benefits, including lower land-based carbon emissions, increasing biodiversity, and increasing provision of community and amenity lands. In terms of carbon emissions, Bordemona is currently calculating the reduction in emissions that will occur from the company's bog rehabilitation and restoration programme. Re-wetting raised bogs means that the carbon that is in the ground stays in the ground. It also provides greater opportunities to turn these sites into carbon sinks. Final conclusions pending. At this stage, the company expects that the reductions arising from this work will be significant. These savings will be counted in the EU's third legislative pillar for greenhouse gas emissions, land use and change and forestry. Other uses of rehabilitation bogs, as wind farms, for example, demonstrate the compatibility of renewable energy and generation with other outcomes, including improved biodiversity. The developed footprint of a wind farm is typically less than 5% of the entire area of the wind farm, leaving the balance 95% for rehabilitation bog as a resort for biodiversity. The importance of rehabilitation from a biodiversity point of view is especially pointed following the recent World Wildlife Fund report, which highlighted the catastrophic 60% loss of animal population in the past 40 years. Restoration of raised bogs will help Ireland meet its biodiversity objectives, including commitments to conserve specific raised bog habitats under the EU Habitat Directive. In parts of the Moramona estate, Lochbura Parklands, for example, rehabilitated bogs provide extremely valuable tourist amenities with over 100,000 visitors every year. In many other parts of Ireland, rehabilitated bogs provide places, valuable communities, amenities and a range of upsides, including incalculable health benefits for people in those areas. In conclusion, Bordemona's life as the Turf Development Board began in the 1930s as a company in a new Ireland that faced immense challenges. The young state needed to demonstrate its viability by establishing its energy independence and use Irish resources to make it happen. Bordemona was instrument and demonstration of the state's ability to deliver jobs and energy independence. Ireland and Bordemona now faces another immense challenge. We are taking action in response to climate change and decarbonising our businesses. It is the right thing to do. All of us in Bordemona are keenly aware that we must make this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I might start with a few questions myself and just list them out if you want to just take note of them.
Could I make a point of order before we start on the questions? And that is that, like others, I'm sure everybody's been dismayed that this document arrived at 20 minutes past 12 today. And I don't think we can sufficiently prepare our contribution, our questions, our interest and our knowledge of what you're about to say in that short given time. I think it shows huge disregard for what this special committee was set up to do, which was to look at how we mitigate carbon emissions and deal with climate change in this country arising from the Citizens' Assembly. I just need to make that point because it's extraordinarily frustrating.
I've been informed that because of our changeover from Lotus Notes to Outlook that the problem here came in, I understand, last night, and the delay in yourselves receiving it today was due to our own internal systems here, but I take your point, Deputy, in relation to that.
I think even last night is not great timing for us to be able to absorb what the company want to say to us.
Okay. We're short on time, so I'm going to keep everyone, even myself, so I'm just going to list out some questions to get the best, I suppose, interaction with yourselves before we bring in our next witnesses. Just in relation to your strategy, one of the central planks of that is around replacing peat with renewables and what you call greenhouse gas neutral biomass energy. And can you expand on how will biomass be greenhouse gas neutral, and how much of the biomass into the future will be sourced domestically and how much will be imported? And have you considered the implications around the air quality issues when you're burning large amounts of biomass, and how are you addressing those issues? Also, have you considered the sustainability impacts of importing biomass into the future, for example, the carbon footprint of shipping, of on-road, by-road transport, and also in relation to the displacement of food production? And how can we encourage Irish farmers to produce biomass when they can achieve higher returns from other types of land use? And also I'd like to know how you're working with Coillte on bioenergy, given your, I suppose, potentially complementary roles in relation to biomass, bioenergy, and just what impact will the move to co-firing with biomass have on emissions from the 3 Midlands power stations out to 2028. And just in relation to the just transition, what feasibility studies have you undertaken which takes into account the skills base of your current workforce? And should all of that work in relation to the feasibility studies and that work not have preceded the announcement in recent weeks in relation to the workforce and the impact that that would have on them? And what support structure would you need from state agencies in relation to that just transition, from government departments to make sure that whatever that transition is, it is robust and it does have the necessary supports? Also in relation to the Boardamone estate, what proportion of the estate has been severely degraded due to drainage and peat extraction? Do you have any figures on that? And what work have you carried out to identify that or to restore those boglands into the future? And if there's any calculations on the carbon storage potential of suitable parts of the Boardamone estate for restoration? And just finally, what are your plans in relation to the production post-2028 of briquettes, peat briquettes and peat moss post-2028?
10 minutes.
No, and hopefully if you can just answer those I suppose as briefly and as succinctly as possible. Thank you. In whatever order you wish. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So, you know, I have subject matters here which we can answer some of the specifics, but let me address up front what we call the just transition. You know, clearly we've got to phase out of peat, and that's something that we in Boardamone fully agree with and fully face up to, and we've made a decision as part of our announcement recently to get ahead of this and stop trying to push back the tide, that we could keep this going as long as possible. So clearly we're committed to getting out of peat, there's no question about that, and it's a question of how we do that in a practical and managed way. And so the first part is what we announced a few weeks ago, where we have to reshape the company to get our financials in order as the PSOs have come off, and so that's the first part, is consolidate and simplify. Then, in order to manage the just transition, we have been on a transition for the last number of years. The first is Heydon Dairy Power, where we started to co-fire that with biomass, and we're going to move the 2 SB ones to it. And we see that as best practices to how to manage a transition. And when we look around the globe, in our neighbours, the UK, they've adopted biomass substantially to provide dispatchable power. Look at Scandinavia. There's currently 10 plants being constructed there to burn biomass. There's another 5 being converted, similar to us. So we see that as a good practice that will allow us time to transition away from peat. And I suppose, why wouldn't we do it sooner? Clearly, the supply of biomass, the supply of sustainable biomass is a challenge, and we're very concerned and very conscious that it needs to be sustainable, and Charles can articulate how we manage that. So the supply of it is constrained. So we couldn't go 100% biomass at this stage, and we're going to do it over a period. We have successfully developed the indigenous biomass supply chain. When we started co-firing Heydon Dairy, there was virtually no biomass supply chain in Ireland, and we've taken up now to about 400,000 tonnes, and about 70% of what goes into Heydon Dairy is indigenous. And that was through working with, and you know, the biomass we burn is sawmill residue, it is the tinnings. We don't burn the trunk of the tree, we do the top and the bottom and the branches basically, and what's left behind. So and the residue of the sawmills, etc., is what we take in. We're working to try and develop further the indigenous supply chain, because obviously it makes a lot more economic sense, and it's a lower carbon footprint if you have it indigenous. However, that's going to take time, and there is a lot of work going on with Quilta, as you mentioned, our sister company, where we're looking at forestation. We're currently in discussions with them, and we've done some trials as to how we can increase deforestation in the country, because there is a challenge of growing forestation in peat-based environment because of the nutrients, but we think we have some technological solutions for that. And we're currently exploring opportunities to increase forestation by 20 to 30,000 acres over the coming years, which would then feed into developing that indigenous supply chain. But let me hand you over to Charles about the sustainability of biomass, and we'll come back to your other questions if that's okay.
The microphone comes on automatically. Yeah.
It comes on. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's not just a simple question of sustainability. There are 3 or 4 different hurdles that biomass actually has to clear. First of all, there's a regulation called the EU Timber Regulation, which means we've got to be certain if something's coming from somewhere else that it's been harvested legally. Secondly, we have very tough, what I would call phytosanitary requirements. You can't just bring what you like into this country. The Department of Agriculture will seek to inspect it and make sure if it's certain species that has been heat treated or whatever, the idea being to prevent pathogens coming in. And then those of you who have been following the climate and energy package that is going through Brussels, there's a whole new set of sustainability criteria that are part of the recast Renewable Energy Directive that biomass will have to meet into the future. So what we've been doing, we've been working with an organisation called NEPCON, who are international experts in the whole area of land use sustainability. And we've developed a suite of criteria along with NEPCON that we will apply in terms of when we're looking at bringing something. We're pretty happy that most things grown within Ireland, under our own sort of forestry regulations, etc., will meet all of these criteria. But when you're looking at developing supply chains overseas, we will have to be sure that they meet these criteria, mainly because under the new regulations coming in the future, all of the biomass we use is going to have to be verified by a third party. So that's part of what will be happening with the Renewable Energy Directive. In terms of the carbon footprint, again, we've done work in looking at the rules and regulations around this are laid down in the Renewable Directive. in terms of the different emissions along the way in the supply chain you've got to count. So we've quantified those, and there are thresholds set in that directive that once biomass is below a certain threshold, it's deemed to be carbon neutral. Obviously, it has those emissions, but if they're low enough, it's deemed to be carbon neutral. So those are the rules of the game that we will work with. In terms of indigenous biomass, most of you will know that quite a lot of Irish forestry was planted here in the 1980s and 1990s. That forestry is coming on stream, so the volume available from Irish forests will increase out through over the next decade, particularly over the period through the middle of the 2020s. Unfortunately, planting rates have dropped back considerably in the last decade or so. We're not planting anywhere near what the Department of Agriculture or Forest Service target would be, and that's a problem. We would have worked along with the Department of Agriculture over a number of years in trying to promote an energy crop scheme, because we see energy crops as being a shorter-term solution. Forests take a long time to grow up to first inning, whereas the energy crops are quicker. But it's very difficult to persuade Irish farmers or Irish landowners to change land use. And we found that there are significant barriers there to changing land use. And that will need to actually get relaunched and what I said, promoted into the future if we want to actually grow more biomass indigenously from the agricultural sector in addition to forestry. In terms of emissions and air quality, yes, and that is quite true. Biomass, when you burn it, is like a solid fuel. It does lead to air emissions. All of the 3 stations operate under IPC licenses. There are strict requirements in relation to emissions of sulphur and nitrogen and also particulates. And so they all have filtration systems, different types of filtration systems on the back end of the flue gases, resulting in very, very low levels of air emissions, either in terms of the chemical side or indeed in terms of the particulates. So burning biomass won't be any different from burning peat. They have to meet the very much the same type of emission limits for the plants. And
okay, maybe on the skill base, and the support for the workers. Anybody you want to comment?
Yeah, I can, of course. I suppose, first of all, we need to point out that what we're attempting to do in Bordnamona is make sure that this is done through a voluntary scheme, and the unfortunate piece in that means that we don't know who it is that's going to take it up. So while we've done a lot of work with all of the relevant authorities, and one of the slides in the deck that we sent shows the mosaic that we're using in terms of the different supports, until we actually get to launch the scheme and have the names, and then we can identify specifically which skills. We have had the experience already in relation to the Littleton briquette factory, where this is what we did. We sat down with each of the individuals and we looked at what are their needs. Do they want to take the package and go immediately to other employment, in which case there's certain types of support we can provide? Do they need upskilling or reskilling or certification in some cases in relation to the types of skills that they've had and been using in Bordnamona, in which case we can provide supports in that regard? Or in certain cases in relation to Littleton, people opted to start up their own businesses and we were able to provide them with supports there. We have been in contact with all of the relevant authorities, both at a national level and indeed at an EU Commission level in relation to that. We can prepare the applications, but all of those applications require the actual names of the people involved and the actual training courses that they want to go on. So we can't take it to that next stage until we actually have the names of the people who are coming forward. So that we're ready now for that stage as we launch the VR programme. We've been working, and I know there's been a lot of press about it, with the Department of Education in relation to the Globalisation Fund, and with the Department of our own department in relation to the Climate Action Fund. Some of the funding options we're looking at are for the staff in relation to the Just Transition. Some of them indeed are in relation to some of the funding options for our new projects in order to provide that alternative employment ourselves directly. So we're working with all of the relevant authorities at an Irish and an EU level in relation to every available support that's out there.
And in relation to the restoration of our bogs, have you any calculations in relation to what role our bogs can play in relation to capturing carbon into the future?
I'll take that one, and I'll differentiate between two different bog types. We have some bogs which Bordnamona acquired over the decades, some of which were initially drained but were never actually fully developed for peat production. and some of which weren't drained at all. Where drainage only has occurred without any peat production on them, those can be restored simply by blocking up the drains again, bringing up the water table, and they can be put back to become active carbon sinks. Okay, they're the easy ones. If you're looking at peatlands then that have been harvested over 2 or 3 or 4 decades, and effectively when you harvest the peat and you take away layer by layer, what you're doing is actually going back in time. And if you go back to a post-glacial landscape, what you had was you had forests and you had fens and reed swamps and lakes, and that's what we will get back to, recreating that type of landscape mosaic. The higher areas will stay dry and will be naturally colonised with woodlands, or could be planted with plantation forestry. Other areas will become wetlands, fens, and shallow open water lakes, so it will be a mosaic. And over time, some of those will become build up and become carbon sinks. Not all of them, some of them will. It'll be a mosaic.
Any calculations done on that?
We have, but they're quite preliminary, because we're still measuring, if you like, the greenhouse gas fluxes associated with the different habitat types. We've done a lot of work on individual vegetation types and what's positive and what's negative, but we've now moved to a larger scale where we're measuring greenhouse gas fluxes on a wider footprint using towers to give us an indication of what a habitat will do. Is it positive, is it negative? And it varies year to year depending on the climate. But in principle, you can take it that if you raise water tables and you make the area wetter, in general it will reduce the carbon emissions. You mightn't get all the way to creating a sink, but you have a less worse source.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to our first questioner, Senator Ian Marshall. You have 10 minutes. Are you taking your time? Or?
Chair, could I please?
This is Deputy Marcella Corcoran. I'm going to just give you a little tap after 2 minutes, just so you know that you're 2 minutes into your time.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Donlan and your team for coming in here this afternoon. You're a very important company in my constituency, and you have always been a great source of employment, and it has been tremendous for the economy in Offaly, Laois and indeed the wider Midlands over the decades. And I very much welcome the statement that you made in relation to wanting to save the company, because there was one of 2 ways you could have gone, which was to close the company up altogether and say, well, we're done now, or actually do something which will ensure that those jobs that you have targeted for voluntary redundancies, that they will be replaced with the new direction that you're going in, and I very much welcome that, and I understand that you've engaged very positively with the local authority in Offaly as well in terms of the stakeholders meeting that was held, and I think engaging like that is the way to go, because it provides, I think, reassurances to people who are so used to having Bord na Móna as an employer, that you certainly intend to be there into the future, and I very much welcome that. I also understand that you have placed the voluntary redundancy packages and indeed the strategy before the Minister. I understand that that has been reviewed now by the Minister and approved, so that will be very good news, I think, for the staff who have been anxiously awaiting and considering where they're going to be. You mentioned in terms of the new jobs that you're targeting, what kind of a time frame can we look forward to with the 500 that are going to be planned? Onto your land use strategy, you've got 200,000 acres, and I'm just wondering what you've been doing in terms of liaising with other state agencies, because a lot of your land obviously is bogland, and yet some of it is quite close to the Greater Dublin area, and I'm wondering, are you looking at potential for liaising with other agencies so that some of that land can be provided for other uses? Are you also looking at for example, Loch Bura, which is a jewel in the crown of, I think, Bord na Móna in terms of in County Offaly. It's a fabulous facility. Are you looking at creating other amenity spaces? Because I know that it is really a treasure, and you know, locally it's very much appreciated, but it's now becoming a major target for people who want to enjoy the outdoors. If you're looking at developing others in that, and also just in relation to the land use, what about rewetting of the bogs? Are you going to look at that in terms of how important they are in relation to your strategy?
Do you want me to stop now, Chair, or can I
No,
stay
you
going?
can use it. It's just there's 2 minutes up. You can keep going, but
Okay,
it's just to
very
give
good.
time for an answer.
The other thing is, in relation to Cloncrane Wind Farm, the one that's there is working away, and you're working on the second one. And I'm just wondering, clearly you've got very good community relationships with the locals, and I'm just wondering, have you looked at any kind of potential, I suppose, community benefit, or maybe benefit where the locals can benefit from having a huge new infrastructure in location to them? I know that there hadn't been any objections, but that's not to say that it potentially might impact on people, and if that's something that you're looking at. Also, in relation to the retraining and reskilling of staff, I think you may have answered that in relation to the Department of Education and the application to the EU Globalisation Fund, but that is something that I think that would be very well worth liaising with, and I know the Department of Education will be looking to apply for that. Have you had a look at the 500 million European, or the 500 million Climate Action Fund that is part of Project 2040, and do you see any of your projects fitting into tapping into that fund? And finally, can I just ask you to let me know a little bit more about the virtual power plant services and the demand side company that you've invested in? That's something that I wouldn't be familiar with, and I'd like to hear a little more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. So whoever wants to come in.
Okay, so let me tackle the jobs one, and then I'll hand it on to John on Cloncrane, because he's our renewables expert. So on the jobs timeframe, so clearly our ambition is as soon as possible. Some of them are more clearly defined. For example, the tyre recycling is 50. We never announced them, by the way, but we just put them in place in the last 2 months. And the other one on the whole plastics recycling area, where the state doesn't do any plastic recycling, it ships everything to Vietnam and China by and large. We believe that will provide between 70 and 80 jobs, and we think that's something we can bring and secure probably in the next 6 to 12 months. So on those recyclable areas, we think we'll be adding about 50 to 100 per year over the next number of 2 years, I'd say. But I think what we're trying to focus on is when we eventually get out of peat, if and when the power plants stop consuming peat in 2027, that means we would stop milling peat sometime earlier than that. There's another wave of job losses or potential job losses, and we want to be ready for that. So the areas of aquaculture and the whole herb area, we're currently working through pilots on those to bring them to a business case. But our objective is they're more medium-term jobs to replace what happens when we have this next wave. On Lochbora, yeah, it is the jewel in the crown. We're very happy with it, and it's a great example of cooperation with the local communities and local councils. And we've just agreed with Offaly County Council to launch a review of it to see how we could expand it substantially. And we're putting money into it, Offaly County Council putting money into it, as to how we could develop it further, and because it's almost a secret, and how we could market it, develop it, and expand the utilities of it. And we're working with a number of other areas. We've Mount Lucas, which also attracts about 20 to 30,000 tourists a year. People going running and jogging there. So we're working with communities right across where we exit out of the peatlands. We're working with communities, any community that has a proposal. We'll work with them, we'll help with them, we'll support them. Let me hand it to John then, in the interest of time, on Cloncrane and the company benefits programme, the community.
And, Deputy, in terms of the Mount Lucas wind farm in County Offaly, it's an 84 megawatt wind farm. We would have put in place a community benefit package, as we always do, when we're developing some of these large infrastructure projects. And that particular wind farm is putting about €100,000 per annum into the local community. And the package itself is split amongst a number of different things. There's support for various projects locally. For example, in the village of Dangan, there would have been support for the laying of an astro pitch at a local national school where the grass was no longer suitable for playing on. So things like that, playground projects which are community based, But we also have and are continuing to develop what we call near neighbour scheme, where we're looking at trying to make sure that the neighbours closest to the wind farm benefit most from the package. Now, there is always that conflict between the package and how it's dispersed locally, and trying to make sure that it's those people who exist closest to the wind farm. So in that regard, we're looking at things like supporting energy retrofits, developing community energy projects, scholarships. All of those types of things are considered under the particular terms of reference of the scheme. The other thing that we've done at Mount Lucas, as Tom has alluded to, is we've actually opened up the site as an amenity place. And to your question in relation to the development of further amenity spaces, we obviously Lochborough Parklands, in terms of trying to commercialise something like that, is a challenge. But where you can develop these amenities co-located with commercial enterprises like renewable developments such as wind farms, we think that's the way to go. That's a very, very considerable amenity that's opened up to people in terms of walkways, cycleways. We've installed the outdoor fitness centres, all that sort of thing. Again, working in conjunction with the local community. The other thing, the final thing that we've done at Mount Lucas is we've created an energy hub from an educational perspective, and we get thousands, tens of thousands of school visits and visits from various interest groups, where we're trying to tell the Board of Mona story from start to finish. But the real idea behind it is to promote the fact that renewable energy is something that's here, that's good, in spite of the challenges there are about developing major infrastructure. And I have to say that project has gone very, very well. So it is our intention to continue to develop those sorts of packages around any of the wind farms, or solar farms for that matter, that we do. The interesting thing around solar farms is the footprint of a solar farm will take up an awful lot more space. The footprint of a wind farm typically takes up about 2 or 3% of the land, and therefore there's lots of space to do other things, including biodiversity and all that sort of stuff. In relation to your question on the electricity exchange project, which is a very, very interesting one, in terms of one of the major challenges that any electric power system has is the instantaneous balancing of demand and generation. And as we move into the green space, most of the generation has been provided by what we call intermittent sources. That is, things like wind and sun. The sun doesn't shine at night time, the wind doesn't always blow. So managing that power system is becoming a greater challenge in terms of keeping the lights on. Infinitely doable, but one of the techniques that's used for that is what we call demand-side management. So rather than switching on generation when demand rises, there is an opportunity to take demand off the power system. Things like refrigeration that you don't need to keep on all of the time. And the electricity exchange, the guys and gals that are working there are working on software. It's really a software development company, a startup company that can effectively use technology to instantaneously help manage that power system balance. And I think when you have a power system like we're heading for, which will be dominated by renewable generation, managing intermittency is going to be one of the biggest challenges. And in terms of the biomass piece, biomass provides instantaneous thermal load to help manage that power system, and it does it while providing renewable energy. So that's one of the ways of doing it. The other side is on the demand side, management side. So Board of Mona is playing on both sides of that, effectively, we hope, contributing towards the achievement of national greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and renewable energy penetration targets.
Questions there, Deputy? Land wetting.
The rewetting of the bowels.
Do we cover?
We've covered, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Just one other question, just whether you have a look at the whether
very
there are certain,
briefly, Deputy.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Chair. Whether you're examining whether some tree species would be better to be planted that would sequester carbon. Have you done research on that? Because it is a lot of a landmass, and we were hearing a lot that we need to plant more trees. So, what kind of work have you done on that?
Yeah, we've clearly we've established that it's difficult to grow in any managed way up to now using current techniques. So we've developed some new techniques. But we have seen that birch grows on our boglands, and we have between 5,000 and 7,000 hectares of birch, which, by the way, is not counted as part of the forestry count in the state. So that's already grown. So as we come out of peatlands, some natural forestation is taking place. But we are currently working with Quilta as to, what type of crop would be the most suitable, and not necessarily from a commercial point of view, but from a decarbonisation point of view. So we're still working through that. So, Charles, you want to add anything to that? But we're still working through what type of species would be, but they'd be native species, broadleaf species, you know.
To move on to Deputy Stanley, you have 10 minutes, and I'll indicate after 2.
Thanks, Sherlock. I want to welcome the delegation here, Tom Donlan and the other panel from Bord na Móna. I think that's timely that you're here, that you're at the Climate Committee. As a member of the committee, I have a particular interest in it, obviously, and as Vice Chairman of this committee, but also, obviously, as a former employee of Bord na Móna. And, you know, I have been frustrated for a number of years, the fact that I felt Bord na Móna and was reflecting what people say to me in the constituency, because obviously at Laois people are very concerned about Bord na Móna and its future. You know, there's a certain amount of concern that the shutters would come down, that Bord na Móna would shut up shop. You know, that phase is over, goodbye. And I think that, you know, there's been a lack of consistency, and I'm saying this very publicly, I think in Bord na Móna over the last decade or so in terms of trying to plan. I sense from meeting yourselves in the last month or so that I get the sense of it that there is a renewal going on, that you are looking at alternatives, that you are trying to develop new businesses, and that's welcome. And we want to be with you on that. In terms of, you know, fulfilling the mandate of Bord na Móna, you know, for jobs in the Midlands and developing industry. But just in relation to the biomass, and this is going to be a crucial issue. You know, obviously, you know, importing it, and Charles touched on it there briefly. You know, there's a huge carbon footprint if we haul it long distances, be it from Indonesia, Africa, be it from America. And I'm just wondering, you know, I know you're trying to play catch up. It hasn't been developed properly here, but just in terms of the research and that you know, the willow scheme that did not work out, right? But silver birch grows naturally nearly on cutaway bog, you know, and on marginal land. And I'm just wondering, you know, how far we are advanced with that in terms of, and I'm giving one example of silver birch, in terms of developing those new supply chains in the Midlands on that. Just in relation to the Bord na Móna plant in Edenderry, you know, there's 70% of the biomass going in there at the moment, Tom, is indigenous sources. Just if you could just outline just briefly where that's coming from, because that'll surprise a lot of people. That 70%, you know, it's 50% already biomass, and that 70% of that is coming from indigenous sources. Just where it's coming from and where quick gains can be made on that. Just in relation to the plans for the American plant, I understand that's now being the brakes has been put on that. But does the company have any plans to develop plants, you know, in terms of in any other countries? I'd be interested to know that. In terms of the jobs, you know, the big fear is that the Midlands become what I refer to as the Rust Belt. You know, literally Bord na Móna, you know, because I mean, before Bord na Móna started up, North Offaly, indeed many parts of Offaly and many parts of Laois, there was very little else there at the time. And I've heard my father, who worked in Bord na Móna, often relaying this when he started in 1950 on it. There was very little employment in places like Edenderry and that. But just the concern is that we don't go back to that. And in terms of, you know, Bord na Móna is going to need substantial funding to make that transition. Okay? You're a successful semi-state company, but you don't carry a huge profit margin. And that's been, if you look at your annual reports over the years, you know, you do pay a dividend, and a very valuable one to the state, and a very valuable contribution in terms of tax and PRSI and everything. But what kind of money, what kind of funding do you think you need to make that transition? And do you see the Climate Action Fund as being a realistic option for you? And the other point I wanted to make about funding, have you been discussing with government in relation to the current subsidy going to peat, right, peat burning, the PSO? Have you made a bid in terms of trying to have some of that funding hived off in terms of making that transition over to renewables? Just in relation to base load, the concern, you know, in the last session here you referred to briefly, you know, with wind and with solar, you know, you can have solar during the day and you can have wind at night. But, you know, they are intermittent sources. And I suppose the need to develop, you know, sources that will, you know, that we can rely on to have a base load there, in other words, continuous, such as biogas. I'd like to see Bord na Móna putting more of a focus on that And I think there's opportunities there to do that because we have a huge agricultural sector. We have a huge problem with agricultural waste. We know that because the government had to go to the EU again recently in relation to pig slurry, which other countries turn into power. They use that for generating power. And my final two questions are around just how long does Bord na Móna intend, or how long do they anticipate that will continue with the sale of peat compost, right, and peat briquettes, right? The peat compost, obviously, you can imagine I have a particular interest in that one, but and just the Gary Hinch project, the last management, in fact, not the last management, the one management before the last management, right? We were all taken on the bus down to Gary Hinch, right? Gary Hinch is a cutaway bog. And just to flag this up, there's a lot of talk about cutaway bogs and the environment, and a lot of environmentalists. I heard people talking about them who never put their foot on a bog. But anybody who has ever been out on cutaway bog would see that they have a huge environmental value because they're lower, they're easier to wet, and there's huge vegetation on them and huge wildlife. But in relation to the Gary Hinch one in particular, I wanted to ask you this question around it. There's huge potential there for it to be used as a water source and for attenuation and to solve a problem and maybe to create something. The River Barrow flows within a mile of it at the other side of the Mountmellick to Port Arlington Road, right? The Barrow's on one side of it and Gary Hinch is at the other. And for 3 or 4 months every year for the last number of years, that the land to the right of it around Clontarry has been flooded. And people's homes, people haven't been able to get out of their homes. The other side of the road, we have Gary Hinch Bog, which is lower. I'm told there is an underground culvert already, one underground culvert already there. But it would be very, very easy to use that as an attenuation. And perhaps part of your plans around aquaculture, Gary Hinch could be used for that. And I'd like you won't have an answer. You won't have an answer for today. I don't expect you to have.
We'll let them answer.
But your Reserve Charles could come back to me on that.
There's only 2 minutes there to answer, so you can keep it brief.
Please.
There. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Deputy. Let me be brief on these. On the indigenous biomass, clearly we've been aggressively developing that over the years, and our sources are mainly private forestry, sawmills, and quilta would be the three main areas of that. And we've been aggressively trying to ramp that up, and we've taken it from when we started co-firing biomass in Edenderry a number of years ago. We could only source between 40 and 50,000 tonnes. So at that stage, we were like the majority was imported, and we've now bring that up to around 400,000 tonnes this year. So we've that. Now we think we're at a limit, right? We've hoovered up the easy stuff, if I could use that term, and now it's going to be more challenging. There needs to be some serious planting. There needs to be some serious land use change to do that. But we have some ideas and some plans in that. Regarding funding for the transition, I think that's a very important question. Today, the funding for this transition is being borne by Bord na Móna, so the restructuring cost is in our plan coming out of our resources, and so that is manageable. But what I would say is that we're looking for all sources of funding, because if we got other sources of fundings in order to help us decarbonise, we could do it quicker, and we could accelerate our job programmes quicker. So that's something we'll be discussing with all parties, both government level, EU level, to see how we could secure more assistance in the overall cost. This round of restructuring which we're doing now, which we have launched, is costing in the region of 50 million. This decarbonisation plan to cut our emissions by this level is about 50 million euro. And we anticipate, as you flash out to 2027-ish, whenever we finally exit peat, there's probably another 50 million there. So it's costing about 100 million in give or take. On peat and briquettes. On peat, we also see significant shift there. We've two businesses in peat. We have the retail business. About 80% of that is in the UK. We see that business going peat-free, and we have been shipping peat-free to the UK for a number of years. All indications are they will continue to move in that direction. So some of our large customers there are saying they want to go peat-free by 2020. we're still in discussions with them, so we haven't finalised on that. So that if that happens, that will obviously significantly reduce the amount of peat in our retail side. But on the professional peat side, we see that as continuing sometime into the future because it's used for growing food. And by the professional sector, and there isn't too many alternatives, commercial alternatives for that. On the briquette business, obviously we've seen a decline in that business. We do still see a need. You know, there's about 20% of the households in Ireland use solid fuel to heat their homes exclusively. We do see a demand for that. What we do anticipate over the years, as that problem gets addressed, and as probably the carbon tax comes into play, that the sales of briquettes will decline, and that's how we see that play out. And on that River Barrow and that Ballynahinch bog, we'll come back to you on that.
The American or over any other plans to develop any overseas?
Yeah, sorry for alluding that and not addressing that. Warnamona is clear in its strategy. We're based about jobs in the Midlands, not about anywhere overseas. Right? This is clearly. Now, if we have anyone over to a few guys to source biomass or a few guys to sell peat in internationally, that's it. But as regard plants and operations, we're a Midland-based organisation. We have no ambition to be around the world setting up factories or plants or expanding.
I'm going to bring in Deputy Dooley, and I'm going to indicate after 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. Just to thank Mr. Donlan and his team for their presentation. And like a lot of the questions have been asked and addressed, so I'll try and avoid repetition. You've finished off really where I was about to start, which is this mandate under which you were established, and in principle the recognition of the necessity to address a jobs crisis as it was in that region. And obviously now, as you go through your transition, there is the difficulty with the loss in employment. And I have to say I'm really impressed with the strategy that you have set out in the documentation. You're accepting that you've got to move on. Others have already identified that it would have been all too easy to wind down the company and start just concentrating in other areas, whether it be other areas of the world or not, using your capital base and your funding. But you haven't. Based on what you've presented to us today, you've clearly identified opportunities in areas where others haven't, quite frankly, in the region. You're looking at alternative energy generation sources, which is good, and you've got the appropriate lands for that, and that's to be welcomed in terms of where the overall energy strategy is going. But again, you're rightly identifying that that's not your core. That's not your core mandate. You're looking at creating employment, and that's why I think, you know, when you talk about the new opportunities, that's really welcome. And I would hope that as the kind of agency that you are, that you'll get the support of other job creation state agencies as well, namely the IDA or Enterprise Ireland, probably Enterprise Ireland in the main, in the kind of supports that are necessary or that would be available to an organisation other than yourselves. When you were established as a semi-state company, the rules of the game were very different to what they are now, based on our commitments within Europe and those supports that would have the potential to cause market distortion. So I would expect and hope that Enterprise Ireland and the government will recognise, you know, through other means, the assistance that you need in that regard. You've covered a lot of the areas that I had an interest in, particularly the size of your ownership of land is colossal, and for that reason, anything or any other opportunities that you can find around the whole carbon sequestration aspect, and Mr. Shire has identified very clearly what you can do with the peatlands and the regeneration of, or the flooding, etc., the re-wetting of the bogs. That's all good, but really to look to whatever other land cover that can be provided. And I come from an area that's well familiar with what we refer to as bogland and being bogmen, as it were. So we fully get that, and the mixed use of the land. It's not terribly arable, and some of it varies very much in nature. But I suppose to try and develop a strategy where you'd look to, as much as possible, to look at the whole sequestration of carbon as an addition to your main purpose, which obviously is to try and find meaningful employment for the people who reside in the area and from within the resources, so long as it's not. So maybe if you have any other thoughts on how that might progress.
I also like the idea that you talk about, which is secondary, but it goes towards lifestyle as well, and it goes towards perhaps ensuring that as society evolves and develops, that our younger people have a better appreciation of nature and habitats. Because I think if we can inculcate or instill that in a younger population, it allows them to live out their lives as citizens that are perhaps more in tune with nature and the environment than the generation that has gone before. So you have a lot of opportunities which I think can have a meaningful impact on the whole issue of climate change and management of our environment.
And that, Mr. Shire.
Yes, I will. Come in on the land side, because there is an important aspect to this in relation to carbon sequestration, but it's also carbon accounting looking ahead, because from 2020 onwards, up until now, we've had the EU ETS emissions trading scheme, and we've had the what they call the burden sharing or the effort sharing agreement, which Ireland struggles with. But there'll be a third pillar from 2020, as Tom mentioned in his opening statement, which is land use change and forestry, and that will have to be reported on in not annual but in 5-year blocks. Now, Bord na Móna's peatlands fall into that category, and not so much the product end, because that gets counted in the energy categories, but what's actually happening on the land itself, and that's why we've been doing work we've been doing over the last decade or more in trying to quantify the emissions from different types of recolonised areas and different types of land use. And because when we stop harvesting, that just doesn't stop emissions. There are emissions still from the residual peat. One way of reducing those is by as I said earlier, by re-wetting. Another way is by planting what I would call high growth, high yielding crops on them. What we looked at, if you get successful forestation on it and you get quite a high growth yield, your carbon sequestration in the trees is higher than you're losing from the thing below. One of the difficulties, though, in terms of what we say growing our own biomass is in the accounting rules for biomass. If you grow biomass as a crop, say willow grew on peatlands, it doesn't very well, but if it did, if we grew it as a crop, we have to count the emissions from the soil as well. If you're using a residue, it's from a factory gate or from a sawmill gate you count. But if you're growing as a crop and you're using all of that crop for burning, the rules of the game is you have to count those emissions as well. And that is why growing biomass for use in either in the power sector or in the heat sector on peatlands is a tricky operation. You need
thinking more in terms of any vegetation that would act as for the benefits or for the purpose of carbon sequestration, not perhaps a cash crop at all, but recognising that you're not going to be harvesting peat. I'm sure there's an awful lot of your land that will never generate any income or any activity into the future, but that there's the potential, perhaps, that there will some vegetation grow that will have some carbon capture over and above what you might normally do.
Yes, it will. Some areas we reflood will become reed beds.
Yes.
And I mean, that, as I said before, that's what was there 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years ago. That's what formed the peats that are down at the base of the bogs. That process will restart. They'll capture the carbon and put it down again as a layer of peat. So yes, there are areas that will become carbon sinks.
Mr. Riley.
If I could as well, just Deputy Dooley, and I think Deputy Stanley also referred to this, ever increasingly over the last couple of years, we've begun to turn our attention within the company to the challenges of decarbonisation in the transport and heating sectors. And I think Bord na Móna is looking very much at anaerobic digestion and biogas production, and how our large land bank, these types of operations, we're also looking at a technology called power to gas, which we looked at about 15 years ago, where you can develop wind farms, for example, and when that wind energy can't be used because the demand on the grid isn't high enough, you actually take it and you create hydrogen as a chemical store that can be then used in the natural gas grid. It can be used for methanation. So it's something that as the transition begins, looking at how we optimise that land bank. I think it's important to say as well, Bord na Móna's total land bank, it's large at 80,000 hectares, but in terms of the total peatlands in the country, it's quite small, and most of it is no longer what we would call peatlands, as Charles has described. So looking at how we best utilise that land bank for infrastructure of scale that can contribute to economy-wide decarbonisation, not just in the electricity sector where we've been focused for years, but on the transport and heating side. It's a new programme that we have and that we're putting a lot of time and investment into, and we certainly hope that we will be able to make some contribution in those sectors going forward.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to bring in our next questioner, Senator Ian Marshall.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, gents. Apologies for being slightly late. Interestingly, I was in a meeting in Belfast regarding environment, climate change and agriculture, so it's all probably pertinent to this conversation. I think the important thing, you referenced a number of times in your documents, is about managed transition, which for me is the critically important part of this. And with a tendency in agriculture to focus on the concerns and not the opportunities, where other industries tend to focus on opportunities and not the concerns, but that's something we have to deal with. I'd like to ask you, with reference specifically to your full life cycle calculations on some of these things, because I think when we look at things with consideration of carbon capture, the sequestration that was mentioned by the deputies, the rewetting of the bogs and the potential that presents the opportunity, when we look at the full life cycle and the true environmental impact of some of the things we do, or the full life cycle benefits of that, when you have considered the biomass importation, are we considering the true environmental impact of that importation? Because the example I always give is a colleague who grows asparagus in the south of England, who grows in the field that he could see the factory that processes it and sees the supermarket that he retails it in, and he actually brings asparagus from Peru. The asparagus from Peru has a lower carbon footprint than that he grows in the south of England, and that's pure and simply because the kilograms of dry matter that he grows in Peru is about 3 times what he can grow in the south of England. So is there enough work, and has there been enough work done on the full life cycle calculations in some of these things? Because I think sometimes in other parts of agriculture especially, we've been good at doing that, and then we look to be a pretty disreputable bunch of people when compared with other industries that don't actually do full life cycle calculations.
Yeah, in terms of biomass, there are about 3 different types of criteria. There's one, as I said earlier, in relation to making sure your biomass has been legally harvested or harvested in compliance with national or laws or whatever. The second one then is to make sure that wherever it's coming from, it's accounted for in the carbon balance for that region. Okay, the new rules say you can't take it. You have to take it from a country that's a signatory to the Paris Agreement. But not only that, they have to have rules and programs in place where they are reporting their carbon balance on the land side back to the UN. And if they don't have that, then you have to go in and do an assessment yourself in terms of the fact that the carbon in that, let's say it's a forest area, is actually not being depleted by what you're taking out of it. So that's on that side. As I said earlier, the accounting side for deeming biomass to be carbon neutral is very, very precise. There's quite a long equation. If you look in the Annex 6 of the Renewable Energy Directive, you'll see this big long equation that has all the little bits in it. So, for instance, you've got to account every bit of the harvesting procedure, the energy used for transport, if you're shipping it, the energy used in shipping, landing it in port here and taking, etc. The shipping end is the easy end, because in reality, if you're shipping people ship stuff all around the world. People ship oil, coal, gas, grain. People ship wood, actually, in fact, not necessarily for energy, but the whole pulp and paper industry ship wood all around it. You're talking about very big ships, 30 to 40,000 tonnes. There only are probably 3 ports in Ireland we can land it in, and practically 2, because in Dublin you can land it, but there isn't the storage. 40,000 tonnes of biomass is a pretty big pile on dockside. So in reality, we're looking at Green or Foynes as the 2 sort of ports we bring that sort of size of ship into. So if you've got that size of ship, as you said, the carbon footprint of actually moving it across the sea is very, very low. In fact, the carbon footprint of moving from port to plant is probably higher than shipping it that distance across the ocean. But all of that has to be accounted in the supply chain.
You also referenced the fact that the plantings are pretty hard to get people encouraged or engaged in plantings and biomass. And I always have found that engagement with agriculture and farmers, the word forests and forestry turns them off very quickly. Has there been much work done on strategic planting, i.e. not taking agricultural land out of production, but taking some of the more marginal land, the riparian strips, the biomass corridors, those type of initiatives where it's additional to and complementary to agriculture as opposed to something other than the conventional agriculture?
One of the problems that there is with looking at a crop, what we've tried to do, I suppose, is to put something like short rotation as a crop rather than a forest, because as you said, forestry it has a long-term implication, replanting obligation, so effectively the land is locked up forever, whereas with a let's say a perennial crop, you can come back out of that at the end of a contract period. In general, you need quite good land to get the type of yield that makes the economics work. Okay. When I said we worked alongside the Department of Agriculture for a number of years in trying to promote this, and invariably people wanted to plant the wet, boggy corner of the farm, because it wasn't doing much for anything else. We put this bit into biome. The reality is the type of species and the breeding that's going on, they're high-yielding clones, but they need high-quality ground to actually get that yield out to make the economics work. The riparian strip one is an interesting one, though, and I know what you're saying, because it's got other benefits in terms of runoff and nutrient capture, etc. So that's an area that is worth pursuing, I think. Yeah.
Have you considered a product like hemp in the biomass discussion on some of the newer products? It's not new, to be honest, but things, I guess, where you have the opportunity of proteins, oils, biomass, soil bioremediation, soil decontamination as part of it, because there, as you said, there are other benefits to those type of crops other than just pure and simply a cash crop that is biomass.
We've been talking to particularly Teagasc and the research they've been doing down at Oak Park and Carlow, where they've looked at a range of different crops there that could perhaps, as you said, have multi products and multi-market. Part of it would come maybe to a biomass direction. One of the problems is, though, woody materials are suitable for the plants from a chemistry point of view. For example, a lot of people planted miscanthus early on, even before the scheme got going here. We ended up burning some in the early days to help out people who were stuck because there was no market. Miscanthus is a grass, and the chemistry of grass doesn't suit boilers. It tends to corrode them. So we've got to be careful how far we go away from woody material into grass or other type of materials, because the chemistry simply is wrong and it doesn't match. Okay.
I suppose that finally the other question was pertinent at the weekend, because there was a bit of discussion in the north about this, that 100 years ago in the bogs of Ireland there was a huge opportunity that was capitalised on, which was with regard to sphagnum moss and the properties that sphagnum moss held as being antiseptic. And when the First World War was raging and there was a shortage in bandages and dressings, all of a sudden there was something that came out of the bogs in Ireland that was hugely beneficial and had a value. Is there much work done with researchers and the institutes and the universities looking at other opportunities other than the aesthetic value of a bog, or rehydration or rewetting of bogs to capture carbon, to actually derive a benefit and a value from that bogland?
There's actually an international group which are active in a number of different countries, looking at what I would call growing sphagnum moss, not just harvesting it from bogs, because if a bog's preserved, you can't really go and steal the carbon from off the surface of it. Growing sphagnum on a sustainable basis is effectively one of the holy grails of the horticultural industry, because if that could be cracked, it would provide a sustainable supply of sphagnum, which they regard as the best material, as Tom said, for growing plants, particularly for propagating plants in. But you need very, very particular and precise conditions to do it. You can't do it on cutaways, because the water table is, you've come down through the years, as I said, and you've got the influence of mineral material on the bottom, which sphagnum doesn't like. So you need to do it on a bog where you're actually still very, very well up the profile, and you've got acid water conditions. And then you have the difficulty of balancing that between summer and winter. We tried it on a small pilot scale in Kilbreen, near Athy, And in the wintertime it got flooded, and in the summertime it was high and dry. So on a small scale, I'd say yes, but to do it on a big scale, over hectares, you would be looking at having to get out on laser level areas to do it, and then with very, very precise water control and then to stop other things coming in. But there are pilot programs going on in different countries, just looking at that point. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. For just one point.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, there's reference a number of times made to AD, and AD's got particularly bad press just at the moment. Some of it, I firmly believe, is very unfair. When you look at AD and the way AD is growing, it's not managed strategically and in an organised fashion. Do you think, your own opinion, would there be a role for some of the organisations, maybe Board Namona, to manage that strategic growth in that, or to look at managing smart energy across the island? Because at the moment it's all happening a bit ad hoc and a bit sporadic. It's not controlled and managed. There's no silver bullet that will fix this energy crisis and address the renewables issue, but someone needs to take this in hand and manage all the different...
Thank you.
Senator, our twin-pronged approach to sort of the extending the core of our businesses is about our power generation business, the electricity business, but also very much our resource recovery business, as we call it. And Board Namona has always viewed AD in the first instance as a waste management solution. And ever increasingly, in our view, as with Origin Green and the ability to, of the land to take residual materials, particularly from the agri-food sector, getting tighter and tighter, we think that AD at scale is likely to certainly have its day. And in terms of the economics of it, so much of what has been looked at in the last 10 or 15 years is looking at the renewable energy first that you can produce from AD. And it's, in the scheme of things, it's relatively expensive. But if you look at AD in the first instance as a sustainable solution to waste management, particularly at scale, and then take the biogas that's produced there, and we're producing electricity from biogas from landfill. We've learned a lot from that, and we believe that the direct injection of that methane back into the electricity grid, or back into the gas grid, or potentially using as compressed natural gas, a renewable gas, as it's defined, will help the decarbonisation of the heating and transport sectors. And the project that we're developing down in Laois is very much focused on, first and foremost, doing it at scale, using that land bank to collect the wastes, and then look at direct injection of the methane or the biomethane produced into the gas grid. We've had great cooperation with Gas Networks Ireland. This is something that we couldn't have done 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it's the real manifestation of decarbonisation and organisations and companies working together. The technical end of it is doable. With all of these things, it comes down to the commercials, but we're going to work very, very hard at trying to deliver projects at scale that can make a contribution, given that we believe that in time, in an ever-increasingly carbon-constrained world, these types of technologies ever-increasingly will become commercial.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Deputy Martin Heydon. You have 5 minutes, and I'm going to indicate after 1. If that's okay.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be as brief as I can, and thank the delegation for coming in for an issue that, as a Kildare South TD, with Newbridge and Kilberry and Drogheda, all in my constituency, your remit and your role is really important to me. And what I'm very mindful of, that Board Namona's history, as you've outlined yourselves, was not just to harvest and provide fuel to generate energy, but also you generated a huge amount of jobs and continue to do so in Kildare and all across the Midlands. And the huge challenge ahead in the decarbonisation, to continue to generate fuel and energy, but through renewables and resource recovery, but also maintaining your position as a critical employer in areas like Kildare, where these jobs are so important, is absolutely crucial to us. So in that regard, I welcome the Minister agreeing to the redundancy package that is much improved in 2013, and look forward to the staff getting, having the time now to consider that. It wasn't ideal that there was a gap in between the announcement of what's been sought in terms of redundancies and that. But can I ask a question specific to Kildare? First and foremost, there's much concern in Newbridge, where most of the administrative and management jobs have been, that somehow in the restructuring, with uncertainty over who would take the packages and where the job losses would come from, that the future of your footprint or your base in Newbridge might be something that you consider can you give me an assurance here that you're staying in Newbridge and that Newbridge is still central to everything you do? Because that's really important, not just to the employees in that area, but to all the secondary business and the jobs that are created outside of that. Similarly, in Kilberry, you know, the 70 or 80 staff there in relation to Peat Moss operations that you do there, can you outline in terms of your existing customers, have they signed up to their contracts for 2019? Do you see a significant reduction in operations in that exercise into next year, or is that something you would hope can continue? And then in the longer term, when as other companies and your customers move to becoming peat-free, how do you see the opportunities with the site in Kilberry? And you mentioned earlier, I was interested to hear of your linkages with the likes of Offaly County Council in certain areas. Have you had engagement with Kildare County Council? Have you had discussions with the excellent people in Kildare Local Enterprise Office to see about the future options there to make sure that we continue to provide very important jobs in that area? I won't go over the climate action funds that are going to be really, really important, at 500 million that you need to be tapping into, but I completely accept the point that you need support, you need financial support to do what you want to do. But look, to my mind, Bournemouth's greatest asset is its staff, and its second greatest asset is the land bank that it has. And I'm really encouraged by a lot of the positive initiatives you're looking to take here. And in that regard, you know, the comments that were earlier about anaerobic digestion is something I think that has huge potential. In relation to that, can I just ask the question then about your linkages with state departments? So, you know, the thing that is striking me the most out of the time we spend on this Climate Action Committee is the need for a whole of government approach, the accessibility and the interlinking of all state departments with each other. Everything you're looking to do is directly involved with other state departments. So can you outline, you know, do you have a direct line of contact with the Department of Agriculture in relation to your areas around land use, a Department of Education around the application towards the Globalisation Fund, how important that will be, Department of Climate Action obviously is going to be hugely important around renewables, but tourism and transport, whether it's electric cars and developing supports there, or the tourism element and biodiversity, which is absolutely massive. Finally then, can you just outline to me your future plans for the Drogheda land fill, you know, the movement from waste to gas sphere? What are your future plans for Drogheda there as well?
Thank you, Deputy. There's about 2 minutes there for an answer, so sorry to curtail you, but we're just conscious of our next witnesses coming in.
Okay, thanks. So, thank you, Deputy. Let me try and be brief. So, on Newbridge, it is our headquarters, remain our headquarters, as a saying in Newbridge, as you say, Newbridge or nowhere. So, we're staying there. Kildare has been very good to us and very supportive of us in the town, and as you're more than familiar with that site, that's an old site, it's a site we'd like to develop, it's a site we'd like to upgrade and spend a bit of money in it, because we're not going out of business, we are reinventing ourselves, we're diversifying and we're building for the future, and clearly we see Newbridge is where we'll base that out of, so that's critical there. Now, yes, some of the management and administrative jobs are impacted there, but as this is going to be voluntary, we're going to try and manage this in a fair and just way, and we're going to give people lots of time and work with them, and you know, our desire is to make that as smooth as possible. On Kilberry, we have been very open and transparent with the people in Kilberry, and our approach as we go through this change management is to be open and transparent. We find that works best, and not to come with surprises and tell people what's going on. And we've been upfront with Kilberry on what's going on with the customers, what's going on with the peat-free agenda, especially in the horticulture business. We have confirmed to them for the 2019 season that the customers have confirmed that they will place their orders. There is a big question about 2020, whether they'll go peat-free or not, the big UK ones, because we manufacture that in Kilberry. We're trying to convince them not to go peat-free, so we're having that discussion, but we're being very upfront with the Kilberry teams on that, and as soon as we have any information either way, we'll be first down there. We're also looking at is there other opportunities we can do there. It is a green waste facility, has a license, how we can, you know, so even if the UK customer said they're going peat-free, it would have a significant impact in Kilberry, but there's no question we would want to, you know, be pulling out of there or anything like that. I want to reassure you on that. And I think you raised an important message about linkage with state departments, and as other deputies raised that as well. We are open to all support and all ideas and all help that we can get. We are not looking inwards, we're looking outwards, because we're going through a significant transformation and a significant change, which has got a lot of challenges. So yeah, we're working with some departments, we know them well, and we're getting doors open where we need, and we welcome any offers to open further ones, and that's to everybody on the committee. But yeah, we're working with Enterprise Ireland, who are really helping us. We're working with agriculture, we're working education on the European funds, tourism. So yeah, we have to broaden our reach now as to who we work with, because the amount of areas we're getting into, whether it's energy, whether it is tourism, whether it is funding, we have to work that network, and we're getting at it. I wouldn't say we've got it sorted out, but we're getting at it, and we've got a concrete plan as to how to do it. Last thing is on Drogheda. Drogheda is, we're very well managed, successful landfill site. We have significantly reduced the amount of tonnage there. We see that future of that continuing. There's new planning gone in for the extension of that, which is currently going through process. We're doing some environmental impact studies as we speak, but subject to extending the planning, we'll be continuing that for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Senator Mulhern next. You have 5 minutes, and I'll indicate after one.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll get straight to the point. I want to welcome the witnesses here. On the issue of just transition, I think this is a key issue for us to achieve low carbon, zero carbon economy and your objectives. And I welcome a lot of your presentation referred to issues that will arise in the Midlands when you stop burning peat, and what that transition is, and the impact it will have on people and your workers, and your plans for 500 new jobs and sustainable businesses to be created, and that's very welcome. And I know well the impact of the closure of a power station, because Bellacorrick closed, and that region in North Mayo is the rural area, the people that work there, it's pretty devastated and has not recovered from the closure of Bellacorrick, because it was a massive employer there. And I would like to think that in all of this, that there can be a re-examination of these areas which were so loyal and serviced Bordnamona. And I know that you own any wind farm there, and you have your planning permission for your 172 megawatts, and it's under construction. And what I have also noticed about this community, compared to a lot of communities, this community, for the most part, have accepted the wind farm to be built. I was at the oral hearing. There were community people there, and they were saying, we will accept this, but we want community gain. We want to see benefits, because people are crying out for some investment, some support, because of the closure of the peat burning power station. And yet, just to say, because really this is the topic that I want to ask you about, I've written to you about it as well, it's not going well on the ground. Here is a community who have accepted your wind farm, and yet there is a serious conflict going on in relation to a community fund and how it is to be administered, and in particular benefits for the people who are most immediately impacted upon, the people whose visual amenity will be impacted upon by virtue of these turbines, which are nearly twice the height of the cooling tower that was there. And I cannot figure how now, with all you have mentioned and all your ambitions to benefit communities and sustainability, that we have people protesting near the site, because, first of all, in relation to the operational matter and the construction of the wind farm, but other than that, that there's going to be a fund there. And I have heard said by some of your representatives that sometimes when it comes to these community funds, 232,000 per annum is going to result in a spend to be distributed among a community. That come year 5, 6, sometimes communities don't have projects to spend the money upon. And yet this community is asking that the individual households within a certain radius would be looked after, and yet it seems that at the moment, in the response I got from you, when I raised this issue about the need for intervention, you have people on the ground, it's not working, the need for intervention higher up, that, sorry if you put me off there, but sorry, in any event, it has been batted over to Mayo County Council. Now I think that you need to show more leadership on this, yourselves and ESB. And I think this can be a good news story, and a formula found that individual households can benefit. I'm not talking about the community centres, etc. are good. But right now, this is a burning issue, and I would like to think that the fire which is burning will be quenched, that you will deal with this issue, and that there won't be more oil on the fire. And some messaging put out there that this is all under control, this is all fine, the money's going to be there. I think The community deserve and need to be engaged with in a better way than what has happened, and the real issues, and every community will have their own issue, tackled, because the money is there and their support for the wind farm is there. So can we not make this work? And that's what I'm asking you today, Mr. Donovan.
So let me address that, and I know John has been spending night and day on this topic, and we're well aware of the issue and share your concern about what's going on the ground. Bournemouth is, a commercial semi-state, and we're not out to see how much money we can make on the back of communities. We're there to, provide jobs, provide renewable energy, decarbonise the economy. That's what we're about. So we have form in this area throughout the country where we've built wind farms and put community gain schemes in place, and we've always found a formula, and we've always found a way through it. And the commitment I can give to you today is we'll do our damnedest to find a formula and to make it work for the community, because that's what we're about. We're not a big private industry who says let's take advantage of some local community. We know the community is important. Most of those communities have been people that have worked in Bournemouth, and that's why we've been accepted throughout the country, and especially throughout the areas where we've been able to construct renewable energy. So we are engaging on it. It's on my table every day, so it's not something we have pushed off to decide.
Mr. Donovan, would you accept the principle that the people most immediately beside wind farms should benefit in an individual way better than somebody 10 miles away?
Sure, and I think, John, you can give more colour to that. But
yes, Senator, I think the fact is we didn't bat this over to Mayo County Council at all.
I have a letter here where it's saying
the mechanism by which the fund is to be dispersed, and you're right to say that the total fund per annum is about 232,000. That represents about 6 million over the lifetime of the project, and it really is a matter of how that money will be dispersed. The decision to involve Mayo County Council was prescribed in the planning. The crucial thing here is that Mayo are responsible for the administration of the fund, but there is a board. The governance around the administration of that fund will see the establishment of a board, and that board will have on it a member from the Wind Farm Development Company, 2 members from the local community, 2 members of local representatives, and 2 members from Mayo. And what we have assured the locals, and we understand their concerns are about how this money will be distributed and the mechanisms by which it will be distributed. We at this point in time can't prejudice the operation of that board, but what we are absolutely 100% agreed upon is that we, as the developers of the wind farm, want to see a governance arrangement that will allow the bulk of that money to flow locally. And as Tom has said, we will work tirelessly with Mayo and with the board, on our seat on the board, to make sure that that happens in the best interests of the local communities. And that we can assure them. But just right now, they're looking for prescriptive guarantees, which we can't prejudice the working of that board. But we know that our seat on that board will be aligned completely with the 2 local representatives, and we hope with the elected representatives in the local community. That would be 5 out of 7 who will ultimately be determining exactly how this money is distributed. And we will work with the local community in that regard.
Just to really brief slightly. So you're basically saying that, notwithstanding, like I have asked for the engagement, you say a board needs to be put in place first that would administer this fund.
Yes, that's how it's prescribed under the planning.
So that means any discussions going on with the community at the moment are without prejudice and don't mean anything. Is that what you're saying?
No,
because
not at all. Not at all. And in actual fact, in order to move this on, we have recommended to the local communities, because we're engaging with them on a constant basis. And a lot of those engagements are positive. Yes, a lot of those engagements at times get quite tetchy and stressful. But we advised the local community recently to move this on. We need to engage directly with Mayo to get the mechanism up and running so that people can get some confidence. And I'm aware that just this week, on foot of our advice on that basis, the local community have formally written to the local authority to request a meeting in relation to the setup of the fund. And I think we think in Bournemouth that's the best way forward, because it will allow to get the board put in place and let the board ultimately decide how this money is to be distributed.
Thank you. We have to move on, I'm afraid, due to time constraints. Deputy Ryan, you have 5 minutes, and I'm going to indicate after 1.
Thank you indeed. Mr Donald, I absolutely agree with you. It's critical we get this just transition right in Bournemouth. A proud and brilliant company, brilliant workforce. We have to get it right. I have a terrible fear that you're leading them down a cul-de-sac and unsustainable approach in promoting the continued co-firing or firing of biomass in power generation. No one I know from the environmental sector, or indeed from any energy expertise people that I know, thinks that that is going to be sustainable. Just to make an example of it, why 2/3 of the energy goes up the chimney is waste heat. As the Sustainable Energy Authority Ireland, they've just published the latest report, and they say with regard to renewable heat where we need to use biomass, I'm quoting them, page 13 of the report, increased use of biomass for electricity generation reduces the national biomass resources available for business looking to use it for renewable heat. It increases the cost of biomass resources for that heat by up to 4-fold. And that's the target we're furthest away from, is renewable heat. How many tonnes of, if you turn all 3 stations full-scale biomass, not peat, how many tonnes of biomass will you need? Are you still thinking of importing that from the States? You had that deal you were looking at of buying forest in Georgia. Is that where you're thinking of importing it from? But first and foremost, how many tonnes of biomass are you looking at?
So over the next 10 years as we co-fire, we will need in the region of 1.3 million tonnes. Currently 400,000 tonnes of that is indigenous, so it's Irish source, and we believe we can grow that over the next 3-4 years to about 600 tonnes. So give or take, we will be at about 50% total of the biomass will need to come internationally.
So you say that in your presentation that you'll be using 1.3 million tonnes in 2020-21, but by 27 you're saying you will go to all 3 power stations.
Correct. So you double the 1.3.
So it'll be 3 million tonnes effectively.
2.6.
Will you bring that in from America?
We will bring it for a number of sources. Our ambition is to try and develop the indigenous as much as we can. And we think...
Can I ask, you said in your own presentation that you might have sales people buying the purchase in America.
Yeah.
Is this deal where you're looking to buy a particular forest in Georgia, is that going ahead?
No.
But you still want to buy some from America?
We want to buy it from wherever the best source of sustainable biomass is, and that if it includes America, but we're not targeting America at the moment because there's a lot of issues in importing biomass from America due to this need to sanitize it. Back then, that program you referred to was to bring pellets. Pellets won't burn in the power station, so America is probably the least likely place that we'll bring biomass from.
I'll just make the point, from the environmental perspective, in a world where everyone's going to have to decarbonise, where that biomass is critically important in heat and in combined heat and power, where you get 90% efficiency, using it for 30% efficiency power generation makes no sense. And there's a real risk that you'll work the company into that dead end, and it won't be sustainable, it won't be continued, and then you'll have another transition you're going to have to do in 5 or 10 years' time. Can I ask, how many tonnes of milled peat do you intend, are you currently exporting, or do you intend to export in the future for that commercial horticulture product?
I don't have the number to hand. I know that our horticulture business, and forgive me now if I'm doing the maths in my head, our horticulture business consumes about 300,000 tonnes of peat, and it's about 50% retail, 50% professional, so roughly in the region 100 to 150,000 tonnes.
Analysis, what the value of that peat, if it stayed in the ground, so you don't open up the bogs, and you can actually do it as a carbon store, what the value of that would be compared to the value you're getting from selling to horticulture growers in Holland or England?
Yeah, I suppose, have we done any specific calculation on that? The answer is no, to be frank with you. But I suppose, you know, what we're about is getting out of peat, you know, and we recognise that it is not good practice to be in the peat business. So that's the statement we came out in the last few weeks, and we're working on this transition. You know, I suppose we could not co-fire with biomass, we could not export the peat for the horticulture business, but then we have a big bang, and you know, all of the employees that are working Born Amona, direct and indirect, which is about 4,000 today, would be homeless. And so what we're trying to come up with is the best balance. And so we're not trying to push back the tide and say, you know, this is good, it's okay to continue to be a fossil fuel provider. We're not saying that at all. We're saying we want to get out of it as quickly as we can, one. But two, We want to build up a renewables business and a recyclable business. So we really want to move from brown to green. It's a question of how quickly we can get there. What we think we've come up with is an aggressive balance. Now, that aggressive balance, in some quarters we've been criticised because it involves 400 plus employees having to lose their jobs. You know, that's a conscientious decision we have to make. But I wouldn't dispute any of your points regarding impacts on environment or anything like that.
Last question, if I can, Kerrick. On that perspective, I'd love to see Boredom boom. Why is it that you mention nothing about retrofit in your presentation? Andrew McDowell, the head of the EIB, was in Dublin last week, and he was saying he estimates in Ireland there's a €50 billion business, and the main problem is he has no counterparties who are looking to lend in that area. John Fitzgerald in this committee said on social housing alone we'd have to spend €5 billion. And I remember Irish Rural Link at a National Economic Dialogue saying that they can't get the workers. Paul Kenny of Tipperary Energy says this business is dead in the water at the moment because there's no workers available to do it. Given Boredom's superb logistics abilities, mechanical and other engineering capability, why wouldn't you switch the company and your ability to borrow and lend and do this in a big scale? We have to be doing 45,000 houses a year within 2 years at an average cost of €30,000-40,000 a house. We should go to every house in the Midlands and retrofit, with Boredom only leading the way. How come you haven't looked at the retrofit energy business? I know you were looking at it 10 years ago. Why have you given up on that energy side of the business?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, when we stood back and look at what Boredom can do that uses our land bank, uses our skill set, is aligned with government policy and will be commercially viable, we've come up with the projects like aquaculture, which is providing food using very low carbon intake, the herbal product, renewable energy, recycling. On the retrofit, you know, we don't see that as, you know, something we could do if we're looking to get people busy, but as a semi-state, we don't think it fits with our brief, right? And there's private industry doing that, and that's, you know, we have to be selective on whether what we do and what we don't do. We have come to the conclusion that the areas that we've identified to move ourselves to over the next 10 years to get us out of peace, 100% out of peace, are the areas we've identified. That's open to debate.
I have to move on because we're very tight on time. We need to be finished this section by 5 o'clock. Deputy Sherlock, you have 5 minutes. And I'm going
my goodness, sorry, I do apologise. I'm just back from another meeting.
If you want me to take somebody else, if you're trying to catch your...
Yeah, I'll catch my breath and come back.
Deputy Pringle.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. Just two quick questions. Just first of all, I recognise what you're...
We're taking members of the committee first, and those who are not on the committee, I'll take you at the end. Is that fair enough? Because in fairness, our members turn up every week, and there's a rota.
Understood.
Okay,
Understood.
thank
That's
you.
all I want.
Deputy Pringle.
Yeah, I recognise that you have a process to go through to get out of carbon and stuff like that there, but I'm just wondering, how long has Boredom known that they've had to get out of carbon?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I've joined the company 6 months ago, and there was 2 schools of thought in the company. One is we can stay in it forever, or as long as we can, and there's another school of thought that says we need to get out of it. We've made a decision as a management team over the last 6 months. We're getting out of it. It's the right thing to do. So we're not, you know, climate change deniers. We're not trying to push back the tide. So I'm not trying to give you a convoluted answer, but there would, you know, because the impact of getting out of it without an alternative is devastating to the communities and the employees and the communities, because Boredom and the communities are the one in the Midlands. They're yeah.
That's recognised, and I think that's very important. And Boredom there's a bigger role because people still have to live regardless. But I just want to get to the bottom of how long have you known? Now you're saying that it's the last 6 months.
I joined 6 months ago. We did a strategic review.
Boredom is around a lot longer
than
you are, you know. And I just wonder how long has Boredom known?
And I think the answer is there was no clear known or view in Boredom as to whether it should get out of it or not.
They've known about climate change.
They've known about climate change, but
they haven't known what their role has been in climate change?
No, I think they have been, they've been on a transition for a number of years into renewables, into recycling, to try and diversify away from the peat business. I think they've known it at one level, but I don't think there is, and this is, by the way, not just the Bournemouth issue, but I think a national issue and an international issue, that, because the consequences of decarbonisation are now being felt by Bournemouth more than any other industry in the country or in Europe, which is like...
What I'm getting at here is everybody has known probably back to the early 1990s. And so Bournemouth has been aware from that stage too, and we're only now, 6 months ago, getting into the transition programme. I think it's not only yourself, it's also the state and everything else.
Yeah, we've been in transition, John's been here, yeah.
Yeah, Bournemouth has been involved in the transition programme. If you go back to why we put the first morsel, irrespective of the rights or wrongs of it, of biomass into the Eden Dairy Power Station, that was in 2008. We had begun to recognise the need to decarbonise, to reduce our carbon footprint back, I would say, about a decade ago. And the transition has been ongoing since then. I think Tom makes a very relevant point here. It's not just Bournemouth and companies like Bournemouth who are grappling with this. Society is grappling with this. You're grappling with it. I'm grappling with it. So I think what's really been important is the manifestation of the reality of the challenge that faces us has probably really come about in the last number of months, where we're now getting down to the nitty-gritty in terms of to do the right thing here and to do what we have to do. The impact from a jobs perspective is going to be very, very significant. And it's a matter of how we manage that. We could switch the light off in the morning and walk away, and that would create lots of problems. What we think we've been doing is positioning ourselves from a diversification perspective to see that today, over 50% of Bournemouth's income and revenue stream comes from areas that are not related to our core peat activity at all. We had to get that part of the piece of the jigsaw in place first of all. We're now at the point where we don't have to shut down and turn the lights off. So we're now beginning to really aggressively move forward in terms of the core transition activity, which is to move away from peat production, something that has served the company and the state very, very well for 80 years. But we have realised over the last decade or so, the end is coming, and it's how we manage that transition and how we're managing that end. And it's not going to be easy. We don't have all the answers. We first and foremost have an obligation to our staff and the communities that we serve, and the plan that we've put in place. Is to try to accelerate that program.
What I wanted to get at was how long have you known?
Yeah, I would say about a decade. I would say we've been decarbonising for over a decade in the organisation. In actual fact, Bournemouth built the first commercial wind farm with a little bit of help back in 1992. So even at that point in time, the company was looking at, more sustainable ways to generate electricity.
Very much.
I have another question, but I think
really
that's
brief because we're at this 5 minutes.
Very worrying for an overall state point of view, because you've only known for 10 years and the state doesn't seem to know yet. My next question is that you say in the presentation there that investments in this area will support the creation of considerable numbers of long-term jobs as well, after talking about renewable energy projects and stuff like that there. I wonder if you what are the long-term jobs?
I think what we articulated earlier, we see long-term jobs in the renewables area, in wind, solar, biogas.
After it's built, what long-term job?
Yeah, well, there's some jobs in maintenance and servicing of those, right, and in the power plants, etc. Not a lot, but good, high-quality jobs. This company we've just bought 50% of Electricity Exchange, and John alluded to what they are. We've just hired 20 software engineers in the last year. Our resource renewable business is employing 300 people currently. As we move up the value chain on that will probably get up to 400 or 500. But the long-term jobs, which is what we're really investing in, is in the aquaculture and the herb-based business. We think they are really low-carbon jobs. We believe they're growth areas. We've done some research on them. We're going to try and get them to a business case, and we're going to do our damnedest to make sure that they do create, 500 plus jobs in the medium to long term. So we're committed to that, because our remit is not just to be a commercial semi-state. Our remit, from the same as day one, is to be a creator of jobs in the Midlands, and we take it very seriously. And if we don't do that, we have failed. And I think if we don't do that, decarbonisation will be seen as a negative. It'll be seen as, people in the Midlands you're carrying the brunt. Bournemouth, you're carrying the brunt. You haven't reinvented yourself. So that's our daily prayer, if I could use that. How are we going to create jobs and that we have teams and projects and our best people on it, working with Enterprise Ireland, IDA, Bordishki Wara, as to how we can do that.
Deputy Sherlock, you have 5 minutes and I'll indicate after one.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad to hear you use the language of the just transition, and I'm glad to hear that you've had 11 town hall meetings in respect of a voluntary redundancy programme. Can I ask you please what the cost of the voluntary redundancy programme will be? That's the first question. The second question is...
50 million, we've already got that.
Oh, you've already got that. Okay, thank you very much.
Bring, by the way.
Total restructuring.
Yeah, it's impairment, all sorts of write-offs and
Keep going, Sarah.
closures. And,
You'll add the time, Chair, I'm sure. Thank you.
We're under time constraints.
Can I ask when you will conclude the negotiations? If you don't have an answer to that today, perhaps you could give us some sort of a note about that process, because I think if we are reflecting the views of the Citizens' Assembly, there was a very clear majority in respect of ensuring that workers would be looked after in this process. I think it's clear from the language that that is your intention, but it would be very useful to have some further detailing around that. So even if there is a note to come back to us with in relation to that process, giving us a greater level of detail, because this is, if you will, the front line of climate change in respect of a sector where we are going to be facing job losses because of the to mitigate against the effects of climate change. So we're very, very interested and conscious of the need to ensure that workers are protected. So I would like to hear from you again, perhaps by way of a note in relation to how that process is being managed, what the end game of that process is, when you hope to conclude that, and what the outcomes of that will be projected. Okay, so that's just by way of a point. Could I also ask how many hectares then will be deemed to be usable at the end of the process as carbon sinks? How many hectares do you propose to use for carbon sink use? Because I listened with interest to Charles earlier in respect of some of the challenges therein. But I think it would be very useful for us to have a more detailed note in relation to the potential for carbon sinks as well, because I think that will help us in terms of, a final, report from this committee reflecting the views of the Citizens' Assembly. Thank you.
Do you have those figures in relation to the number of hectares?
Not here or not off it. I mean, yeah, we are looking at the, that we have what's called a framework in relation to future land use, covering all sorts of different, the renewable energy side, the potential forestry side, commercial applications that might come in, areas that we know, particularly along the Shannon Valley, that will be very, very easy to re-wet or to re-flood. Other areas which, if we re-flood them, we'll have an awful lot of water meadows in the surrounding farmland around them, so that's not the place we're going to go. Some areas that will go towards woodlands or forests, etc. So yeah, we have a broad... Can
you send us anything in relation to that?
We'll have a look at actually putting some sort of quantification on that, and also trying to quantify the carbon impacts of that.
Just to remind everybody again, because sometimes people think that Bournemouth is responsible for the entire peatlands in the country. Our total land holding is only, I don't say this lightly, it's only 80,000 hectares. So even if we were to put 50% of that in time into something that might be commercial from a sequestration point of view, in terms of the overall land use and the contribution to the state's balance, it would still be relatively small.
No, but I've asked a very specific question in relation to Bournemouth, so it would be useful.
If you come back with a note on that, it would be great.
Thank you very much. And the very last question then, and I don't expect an answer today, but will you just explain to us by way of a note as well for the committee into what the electricity exchange DAC investment is really about? Because on the face of it, it seems self-explanatory, but a more detailed note would be very useful for the committee as well. Thank you.
Senator Sullivan is gone, so I'm going to bring in Deputy Fitzmaurice next.
Gramago, thanks for your presentation. A few quick questions. Mr. Donlan, in Donnelly's coal yard in Galway last year, you weren't there at the time, it was closed, redundancies. Sligo this Christmas, the coal yard is closed and Bournemouth involved in it. Derry Fodda in the west of Ireland, which is the western side of the Shannon, out of peat production. You talk about 150 jobs going. I think you need to be honest to this committee. Those are redundancies. Those aren't jobs being replaced. Wind turbines don't replace jobs. I think you need to be... What? I've listened to you about Kildare, and that's good that you're going to keep your head office there. I've heard you talking about you're going into Equa. That's a 7-year project. I've talked to your own people. May or may not work. and you're also growing herbs for medicines, and that may or may not work. So we have no plan going into the future. What have you envisaged for west of the Shannon that has been good to you down through the years, where there's 50 to 60 jobs going on dairy fodder at the moment, and absolutely no production west of the Shannon from next January on? A place that gave you good workers and worked with you down through the years. That's the first question. In the line of the biomass, Mr. Shear, what is the carbon footprint of a tonne of biomass that's brought from Africa or North Africa, brought from Australia, or brought from parts of America that you're talking about? Give me the accurate carbon footprint per tonne. Third question is, you've talked about growing some here in Ireland. I've spoke to farmers that is in the scheme with you at the moment, in the biomass scheme. The facts are that if you're down south in Ireland to rent land for the dairy sector at the moment, it's €400 per acre. If you're in other parts, it may be 2 to 250. The biomass is not returning. Are you calling on the government to give a proper subsidy to that? Because realistically, the figures you are talking, you're in wonderland if you're thinking farmers are going to go down the biomass route that in parts of Ireland. And we have heard about fuel security. We have heard the green agenda over the last number of years telling everybody in this country, let's go green and we won't be importing. The facts are, and correct me if I'm wrong, in this biomass that you're going down, that we will be importing between 65 over the next, between now and 2027, between 65 and 120 million of extra imports, money going out of the country because of the decision that you've taken in the last 6 months.
Okay, let me take the questions one by one. You know, what we announced in the last few weeks was a very difficult decision, and I don't want to sugarcoat it that we have a plan to replace all the jobs in the short term, and that's the harsh realities we're dealing with, and that's why what we're trying to do in the short term is work with those affected employees and do it through a voluntary basis. So yes, some bogs will close. We're working with those. Yeah, we're working with those people, and we're working with the group of unions to say, well, if everyone doesn't want to take voluntary in that area, can we relocate them to another area? And we're trying to do this in the fairest measured way. But we don't have all the answers, and it's not, and I don't want to dress it up that this is all fine and dandy. It is not. We're talking about 400 plus people losing their jobs, and that's the harsh reality of decarbonisation hitting our door. So I don't want to dress that up. Now, as we develop these medium to long-term jobs, they might and might not work. You're right? But we're going to give it our best shot to get them to work. And if they do work, we can deploy them in many areas. And but at first we need to see, can we get them commercially viable? We're doing our pilots, we're doing our trials, and then if they work, we can decide where they go.
Why isn't there pilots west of the Shannon?
Well, we've decided to put a pilot in a particular area, and we actually the reason we put it in Mount Lucas was there was a wind farm there. We had road infrastructure and electric infrastructure, and it was the most cost-effective thing to do. And that was based on no other reason than there's infrastructure there that we can drive in. We can use the infrastructure from that. And we've made no decision on west east of Shannon. We'll keep that in mind as we go forward. I think growing biomass in Ireland, you're right, is challenged, and yes, it needs further support from the government. We are working with the Department of Agriculture. Yes, it needs a step up, and I would share your concern that importing it doesn't make sense. But as part of the just transition, we don't have any other option in the short to medium term. We would love to see it developed here and be 100% indigenous. We don't see that happening anytime soon. We're working hard on it, but I think, yeah, if we can get improved grant schemes, and make it commercially viable for the agriculture area. Yeah, we think that's something that we can all work on together. We're with you on that. And on the carbon footprint of biomass, do you have that to hand, Charles?
No, I don't. But in principle, I can tell you, for biomass to be sustainable, it has to have a carbon carbon footprint per supply chain. Obviously, there's energy spent in getting it getting it harvested, getting it processed, if you're chipping it up, if you're moving it around, that has to be low, a certain percentage compared with what the Europeans call a fossil fuel comparator. And that's a set figure, set for all, everybody across Europe has that G. You don't compare it with what the fuel you're replacing. It doesn't get compared against peat. It gets compared against what's effectively an average emission for the European grid, based on gas and coal plants on the European system. It's 183 megajoules.
Can I just go in on one thing? What you're saying is gas and coal obviously is to be, gas and coal has to be brought from one place to the other. So you're comparing, if you have your peat in the bog below in the Midlands and you're bringing it in by your little train into the different places, are you telling me that you're not allowed to compare it to that you have to compare it to gas and coal?
Yeah, that's the rules of the game. That works out.
The European Union has gone mad if that's the case.
That works out at about, it isn't compared per tonne of that, it's compared per megawatt hour of electricity. That works out at, the fossil fuel comparator, 650 kilos of carbon per megawatt hour. We have to be less than 70% of that, which is about 200 kilos of CO2 per megawatt hour. So in other words, if biomass is less than that, it's deemed effectively to be carbon neutral. Doesn't mean it is carbon neutral, it's deemed to be carbon neutral.
What is peat if you bring it from right beside the station?
You mean the peat? Oh, peat per megawatt hour is over about 1.1 tonnes of carbon per megawatt hour is what peat would be. That's not counting the transports. The transport part is quite small.
Could you send us those figures, Mr. Shear, with
Yeah,
possible?
yeah, we can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring in Deputy Cowan. Sorry you have to wait, but it's just we have 22-member committee, and I take them first. Thank you.
I understand. As brief as I can, I don't want to repeat what has already been said. Suffice to say that the ramifications and the repercussions for the region as a result of decarbonisation have been and are great. And as Deputy Pringle was here, I'd remind him of power stations being closed in Ferban and Road and the harvesting associated with that and the jobs associated with it. And that will show that the decline that has been evident in the region, and particularly, I might add, in Offaly, where there are 900 workers presently, compared to 4 in Kildare and 200 in Longford and 50 in Westmeath and 12 in Laois, I might add. So, but they're great for workers, for their families, and obviously for communities. And notwithstanding the diversification that has been taking place and is planned, whether it be in relation to existing operations, in relation to wind and solar and waste, and exploratory measures that are there presently in relation to fish farming and herbs, energy parks, and of course the success we've seen at Lochbore and the potential it has to grow as well. But notwithstanding that, you can no longer meet the remit that was placed upon the board back in the 40s when De Valera and Todd Andrews put that in place. That remit now is in the hands of the government, and this gets very political, to be quite honest. And there's an onus of responsibility in relation to policy and in relation to commitment on the part of the government to put a just transition or sustainable forum in place that is adequately resourced for that region, notwithstanding the commitment that we've heard that is there today initially in relation to the package. If I might finish, please, in relation to the package of 40 million, and we have to learn lessons from what happened in Lytton, and 23 meetings took place before an agreement was reached there. So we don't want to see that taking place in this regard. And we know too, state agencies and bodies and departments that I met with, as sponsored by Offaly County Council last week, have a responsibility without being instructed at all. And we would hope that they live up to the expectation that is there in relation to retraining, reskilling and so forth. But the questions then remain the commitment to the workforce that will remain or are expected to remain up to 2027, as you say. And I have just some specific questions in relation to that. In the expectation that I might add that ESB make the application for co-fuelling, which is long overdue, I might add, and I would hope and expect that they do so as committed to in the next week at least. But that being the case, the PSO that was in place, can you square this circle for me? In relation to the cost per tonne, in relation to fuelling the 3 power plants as envisaged. With the PSO, it was in the region of €40 per tonne, I understand, right? The PSO will be gone next year, and we're back to €20 per tonne. And if it was difficult, it was difficult enough to maintain and to ensure the viability at €40? Can you guarantee and ensure the viability at €20? And can you make that commitment, in cast iron to assure and reassure those workers that will be associated with providing and harvesting the peat to make those stations work, assuming they get permission and assuming the application is made as envisaged?
Deputy.
So I think you've touched on some very important questions. First of all, part of the restructuring we're doing, especially at management and administration level, is to take down our cost base. So to be able to absorb the elimination of the PSO, if I was to use that word, so we take down our costs so that we can keep them going. Not as profitable as we were in the past, but at least we want to get to this just transition while we build out other areas of opportunities. I think those plans continue to run will be based on a number of factors. One, you touched on them. Will they get planning? Right? How long they'll get planning for? The two SB ones. Will the Eden Dairy one get planning when it comes out of planning in 2023? Another very important factor which will determine whether they'll be viable going future or not is the cost of carbon. Currently we trade carbon as part of the European scheme. Today it trades anywhere between 15 and 20 euros a tonne, which we have to buy. A number of years ago it was 5 or 6. If their cost of carbon went up substantially higher than that, as in plus 30, then there would be a question on the viability of those plants.
That just gets to the point. And you mentioned last week when you were interviewed, or whenever it was, and the announcement was made, of this acceleration, and it is an acceleration rather than a cliff edge, that the onus, that the workforce and the communities get it, you said. Yeah. But unfortunately, you're now saying that you cannot commit exclusively, which you can't because the planning permission hasn't been applied for, despite the fact that I would have thought there's a blueprint there for permission to be repeated at the two plants in Shannonbridge and Lanesborough because of the process that was gone through in relation to Eden Dairy initially. And, I would hope and expect that those who cast doubt on the potential for Eden Dairy to meet its commitments and associated with the EPA and the planning conditions, that they will be mindful of the expectation of greater communities and region in relation to these two plants when they look at the applications that are made. And that's not to say that they should get a carte blanche, but I think people should be respectful of the process that has begun here and allow it work itself out and allow communities adjust to that change. But the point I want to make to this committee is that based on what the CEO has said, there is no cast iron commitment that he can live up to the expectation that he has by up to 2027, which means that many of those jobs remain in jeopardy in the short term, not in the medium term or long term, in the short term. And that goes back to the point that I made. They can't meet the remit that they were given in the 40s, and that's understandable. And that's why this government has to not depend on existing sources of revenue for the region, which are out there already from a national perspective and can be drawn from all over the country. There has to be a specific targeted initiative and effort on the part of government, together with the EU, to ensure this region has a chance of getting through this and growing out of it a stronger region than it was going into it. And to that end, I won't be found wanting, and my party won't be found wanting, and I hope this committee makes that point to the Minister and to those in responsibility who have a responsibility to this region, that I am putting them on notice that this is indeed very much political.
Yeah.
If I may, just to clarify one point, when I said the Board and Mona workforce get it, they get the challenge. Don't accept it. They don't. You know that well. So they get the challenge, and what
we've got for the last 10 years.
Yeah, and what we've been working with through them is be as open as transparent as possible. On the 3 power stations, we have run Eden Dairy on co-firing with biomass for a number of years. So we've proven that's a success. So we're optimistic, right? There's no guarantee, but we're optimistic. And we're optimistic that the 2 SB plants will get planning. And we're optimistic that we'll co-fire them. And we're optimistic we'll keep them running. So that's our job. And that's what we're going to...
Sustainable at the reduced rate.
Yeah, I believe it is. And if it isn't, we'll reduce our costs further, right? And the cost we're reducing is at management level, not at the worker level, right? But that's, this decarbonisation is coming with a price. And so we need all the help we can get.
much, Mr. Donlan. And I think our committee is very aware of the just transition and the protection of jobs, and it's something that we'll be very cognizant of. I know government is very cognizant of. I want to thank you, Mr. Donlan, and all of your officials for coming in here this afternoon. I think it's been a very worthwhile engagement, and we'll suspend the meeting now for 5 minutes to allow our witnesses from EirGrid to take their seats. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Mark Foley, Chief Executive Officer of AirGrid, and he's joined today by Robin McCormack and Valerie Heydon. Heydon, is it? Yeah, Heydon, thank you. So before we commence, I just have some formal proceedings to begin with. So I wish to advise witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I now call on Mr. Foley to make your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chairperson and members of the committee, at the outset we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to come before the committee today to provide an overview of who we are, what we do, what we see are the challenges facing the island of Ireland in respect of climate action, and how AirGrid can play a key role in enabling Ireland's transition to a low-carbon economy. This meeting comes at a time when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the 8th of October last issued its most stark warning to date. Let me quote an extract from their press release. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by mid-century would require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. I hope that we can provide some guidance on where progress can be made on the immense challenge that climate change presents to you as policymakers and indeed ourselves as a vital commercial utility. May I start by commending the work of the Citizens' Assembly, who, when exposed to international experts across many disciplines relating to the science of climate change, demonstrated great understanding of the subject matter and delivered a remarkably coherent and consensus view via a set of recommendations on the necessary direction of travel for both the Irish economy and Irish society. As background, for those less familiar with our work, since 2006, AirGrid was spun off from the ESB, as required under European directives, to manage, operate and develop the national high-voltage electricity grid for Ireland, and the industry term for AirGrid is the Transmission System Operator, or TSO. AirGrid subsequently acquired the system operator for Northern Ireland, termed SONI, and since 2009 the transmission system functions on a fully integrated, seamless, all-island basis. We operate on a 24/7 basis, 365 days of the year, from control centres in Ballsbridge in Dublin and Castlereagh in Belfast, to bring power, both conventional and renewable, from where it is generated in hundreds of different locations around Ireland to where it is needed in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. We use this grid to supply power to industry and businesses that use large amounts of electricity here in the Republic. Our grid also powers the ESB's distribution system, which supplies the electricity you use every day in your homes, businesses, schools, hospitals and farms. We also manage and operate the all-island electricity market, where generators, suppliers and other electricity traders buy and sell electricity in real time, a market with an annual turnover of approximately €2.5 billion per annum. As recently as the 1st of October 2018, we managed the transition of the market from the old single electricity market to the new integrated single electricity market, which places the Irish electricity market on a pan-European trading platform, and this has created the environment for a more competitive market and opens the door for greater connectivity with Europe in the longer term. A vital important part of what we do is developing new electricity infrastructure which supports both the growing economy and population. In doing so, we're very conscious of the impact on communities and have made huge efforts over the last number of years to engage with communities to improve overall understanding and acceptance levels for energy infrastructure across the island. We support competition in energy, we promote economic growth and job creation, and most importantly for this committee's consideration, we enable the growth of renewable energy onto the electricity system, and I will elaborate on this later in my presentation. As a nation, we're becoming increasingly aware of the stark reality of what is happening in the world. I believe this committee, working on the strong platform provided by the Citizens' Assembly report, is a very positive step towards addressing Ireland's trajectory towards a low-carbon future, and thus addressing the very real and existential threat that is climate change. I'll speak to three major topics which are very relevant to Ireland's decarbonisation challenge. Then I will offer you some broad-reaching comments in my final conclusion. Firstly, I want to speak to the critical matter of successfully integrating renewables on our power system. The island of Ireland is an isolated, standalone electricity system on the western periphery of Europe, with limited connectivity to the UK as an alternative source of power. This contrasts with mainland Europe, where extensive cross-border interconnection creates significantly greater flexibility for European countries. The physics of electricity, which originates from renewable sources such as wind and solar, is significantly different from that deriving from conventional generation, which has been around for over 100 years. As a result, significant challenges to power system stability arise when attempting to integrate high levels of renewables on a conventional or synchronous power system, to use the technical term. If you asked me 10 years ago as to what level of renewables could be accommodated on Ireland's synchronous power system at any point in time, I might have said 10% as an absolute maximum. 10 years of pioneering work by our scientists and engineers under a programme called DS3 has delivered a world record level of 65% renewables on the power system, an achievement which will underpin an expected average delivery of over 30% renewable electricity on the Irish system in 2018. Our innovations have delivered a new industry and system services, which resulted in the award of over 100 contracts in May of this year. These services ensure system stability when high levels of renewables are on the system. Our achievements in this space are recognised internationally as we entertain fact-finding missions from across the globe on a regular basis. Indeed, I was privileged last Thursday to host EU Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic to our National Control Centre to demonstrate to him how we have innovated to achieve this renewable energy milestone. The EU is looking to replicate Ireland's achievements on a pan-European basis, having allocated €20 million to a project called EU Sysflex, which is being led by EirGrid. But we have stated that we can, and I believe we will, go further in terms of integrating even higher levels of variable renewable energy onto the grid. We've publicly committed to moving to integrating 75% variable renewable energy on the system by 2020 in order to underpin Ireland and Northern Ireland's ambition to deliver 40% of electricity from renewable sources by this date. The renewable electricity target is a vital component of Ireland's 2020 overall renewables target, particularly in a context where transport and heat targets are under severe pressure. This is challenging, but it is our belief that it can be done, and more importantly, it must be done if we are to truly move away from our dependence on fossil fuels. Secondly, we're endeavouring to transition to a low-carbon economy at a time when the forecast for both economic and population growth is very strong. Infrastructure across many, if not most, sectors of our economy is under pressure, and demand for electricity, indeed all forms of energy, is expected to grow over the next 5 to 10 years. The growing demand means that advanced planning is now more important than ever. This is as relevant to planning the future needs of the electricity grid as much as it does for schools, hospitals and roads. Over the last 2 years, we've devised a scenario planning report called Tomorrow's Energy Scenarios. This sets out our 4 potential energy scenarios to the year 2030. The scenario which will be realised depends greatly on which policy levers are put in place by policymakers such as yourselves over the next few years. If one looks at what is happening in the global economy, and we must remember we are one of the most open economies in the world, I believe it is reasonable to say that the world is on an inexorable trajectory towards transitioning to an economy and society which is free of carbon. Ireland is unlikely to diverge from this global trend, and I suggest, considering our current position in the European League table, that we need to refocus and accelerate our efforts to decarbonise our own economy and society over the next decade. I can assure this committee that we in EirGrid understand the compelling case facing the country and are working to ensure that we will be to the fore in enabling this unprecedented transition. Thirdly, the question is repeatedly asked about where the next generation of renewable energy will come from. In terms of a managed transition from fossil fuels to renewables, we see there being a requirement for a broad spectrum of renewable sources. To date, the bulk of renewables delivered on the system and forecasted to 2020 has been onshore wind. We should ask ourselves, why has onshore wind been so successful so that we can leverage those learnings as we look to the challenges of the next decade? Let me give you those key learnings. In 2008, government set a clear and unambiguous target of 40% of electricity from renewable sources. The policy was crystal clear. Secondly, government provided the policy framework to enable the regulatory authority to administer a connections policy for renewables projects. Thirdly, government designed a support mechanism with appropriate state aid approval from Europe. And finally, industry, both private sector and commercial semi-state, supported by an ecosystem of planning, engineering, legal and financing expertise, responded and delivered projects varying in size from a few megawatts to over 100 megawatts in scale, resulting today in over 5,000 megawatts of onshore wind across the island of Ireland, which will be the case by early next year. Whilst onshore wind will continue to play a vital role in the next decade, it cannot provide the totality of requirements for Ireland's decarbonisation needs. There is a role and a need for a broader range of technologies, including solar and offshore wind. EirGrid is currently progressing connection offers for a significant quantum of solar projects across the country, and we look forward to the Department's plans to design an appropriate support scheme to enable solar projects to be financed, constructed and ultimately connected to the power system. Committee members, I'd like to draw your attention to the area of greatest opportunity and positive impact for Ireland in dealing with the challenges around our carbon emissions trajectory. I'm referring to the enormous potential in Ireland for offshore wind energy developments. Consider the fact that a very big onshore wind can generate 100 megawatts, while a small offshore wind can generate 500 megawatts, with the potential to exceed 1,000 megawatts. Currently, there is only one 25-megawatt offshore wind farm in operation in Ireland, or Northern Ireland, with approximately 5.6 gigawatts having applied to connect to the electricity system, predominantly off the East Coast. Offshore wind is a very mature technology. Prices have dropped considerably in the last decade. European auctions for offshore wind farm projects have seen highly competitive pricing, and frankly, the time has come for Ireland to embrace offshore wind at scale as a vital element in our fight to reverse the trajectory of carbon emissions from industry and society. However, our understanding is that the consenting regime for offshore wind farms is not fit for purpose and is therefore operating as a barrier to developers to committing development capital to new projects, which means a pipeline of such projects will not be ready in time to compete for future auction processes. From our perspective, we in EirGrid have conducted significant studies to identify the optimum delivery model for planning and enabling the development and connection of offshore wind to the Irish transmission system. We have assessed a number of grid delivery models in other jurisdictions, and our view is that the most cost-effective and optimum model is the centralised model, which is used in countries such as Denmark and the Netherlands. The centralised model would mean EirGrid, in a coordinated way, would master plan and secure planning consent for an optimum offshore grid network into which offshore wind developers would ultimately connect. Phase 1 of such a master plan would be focused on the east coast of Ireland. Finally, I'd like to advise the committee that EirGrid is advancing our Celtic Interconnector project with our counterpart in France, a project which is designed to provide 700 megawatts of interconnection between Ireland and France by 2025-2026. This project is vital to supporting Ireland's renewables ambition, as it will provide a vital outlet for Irish wind energy at times when demand on the system is low. EirGrid has a vital role to play, and we will play that role in enabling the transformation of our economy and our society, a change which is arguably greater than the Industrial Revolution or the arrival of the Internet. I would like to conclude with some broad-reaching comments which are not necessarily restricted to EirGrid's remit, but where we can offer an authoritative and dispassionate view on those matters which are currently impeding progress in the renewable space. Firstly, I think the challenge is very significant and the urgency is manifest. Secondly, electricity has delivered the best performance to date in terms of decarbonisation, and it is likely to bear a heavy burden in the next decade. No technology offers a silver bullet. By our calculations, onshore wind, solar and offshore wind will all be required in significant quanta to make the necessary impact in the next decade. Explicit targets for 2030 at a policy level for Res-E, Res-H and Res-T must be set, which when combined are capable of delivering the necessary overall result for Ireland. Wind energy guidelines for onshore wind are essential to enable the next generation of onshore projects to be consented. A robust policy, consenting and connections regime for offshore wind needs to be put in place as a matter of urgency. And lastly, technology-specific support mechanisms, example offshore, need to be signalled, designed and made ready for implementation in the near term. I hope we've given members an understanding of what we already have achieved in the fight against climate change and what we believe must now happen to ensure that all elements of the power system can make the necessary contribution to delivering a substantially decarbonised electricity system in the next decade. I commend you for your efforts to date and would encourage you to be ambitious in terms of the report you will be writing for government in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foley. And I might just start with some brief questions myself before I hand over to my colleagues. You meant that the timing on the introduction of the commercial interconnectors, Green Link and the Celtic interconnector, am I right in saying you said 2025 to 2026? Is that
25-26 is the timing for air grids, Celtic interconnector. Green Link is a private interconnector which is being progressed by other parties.
Okay. In relation to offshore renewable energy, and we hear clearly what you said there in relation to the consenting regime, and that's something that we as the Oireachtas need to work on. What are the other obstacles to development of a successful offshore renewable energy industry from a grid point perspective, and is it currently able to handle that additional renewable energy? I understand that our current peak demand currently is 5 gigawatts, is that correct? And the potential is, what we hear, is up to 50 gigawatts, and just the potential or the capacity of the grid currently. Also in relation to the rural grid, the capability of handling greater levels of renewable energy, if you could expand on that, particularly in the Midlands and the West Coast. And we often hear, so there is a certain narrative out there of, if in the morning our 3 power stations in the Midlands were shut down, could you talk to us about the implications, the impact that would have? And just finally, in relation to data centres, what is the impact of increasing numbers of data centres on the grid, and what are the projections of future growth in this area, and how does it relate to renewable energy demand? And also, who would pay for the additional renewable energy required by data centres? Why have power purchase agreements not taken up here have been taken up here as they have in other countries? Because that is a question that has come up, I know, in our other committee in relation to, I suppose, the capacity in relation to data centres. So I'll just start with those questions first.
Okay. Well, I will handle the questions on policy, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Robin McCormack, who will deal with the technical issues around capacity and the ability of the grid to handle both volume and indeed renewables. But you asked about the obstacles to offshore. I've mentioned the consenting regime. The second dimension is a connections policy. We don't have at the moment a connections policy where a developer can come into us in a regulated context and get a contract with ourselves. And thirdly, the notion of an auction framework, essentially, that is, in our view, specific to offshore, that recognises the specific technology that is offshore. We don't have such a regime in place at this point in time either. So they're the 3 key issues and related 3 impediments to developers putting significant development capital into offshore wind at this point in time. That's our understanding. Robin will speak to the capacity questions you've raised.
Yeah, thank you. The big issue we have is that the demand is increasing, and therefore to maintain 40% from renewable sources requires an increase in renewable capacity on the system beyond 2020. And if we want to do better than that, then we have to increase the rate at which renewable capacity is connected to the system. We have been very successful in terms of connecting onshore wind, and we now have a fresh challenge of connecting offshore wind at a quantum that will match and exceed that 40% target. So the offshore wind interest has been on the east coast, which is closer to the demand than those large generators that you talked about on the west coast. So it's well placed in terms of grid infrastructure. So if an offshore grid was constructed, it would be connected in to an area of the grid that needs and can benefit from support. So the idea of if you like, a centralised plan or a strategic plan for offshore wind has lots of benefits in terms of being able to set out the plan and deliver it in a coordinated manner in parallel with the offshore development. Traditionally, we wait for someone to come along and say, I want to connect your system, and we then look at what the implications to the system are, and then we develop an infrastructure plan to manage that. More recently, with the data centre growth, we've had a rush of connection requests for significant amounts of demand, and that puts pressure on that process, and we've had to look at that afresh to try to find a more strategic way of managing that. And that will continue to be the case in terms of how we match our system capability with the demand that's there, and we have to match the contribution that the transmission grid makes and the contribution that generation support makes. So we've talked a little bit about data centres and their requirement to be supported from renewable energy. So first of all, the renewable energy sources have got to be there. We have an integrated single electricity market that allows all players to construct contracts behind the scenes, bilateral contracts, and the market allows us to run the system in the most efficient manner and deliver the best prices to customers.
And in relation to the power purchase agreements, why do you think they haven't taken off here as they have in other countries?
Because we have a market for electricity at a wholesale level, but behind that there will be bilateral trades between supply companies and generators. So they're part and parcel of how the industry has moved forward. So in a sense, there are power purchasing agreements, not in the, if you like, the old traditional sense of a power purchasing agreement and no market. We do have a very, very active market that is proving to be successful in that. It gives better opportunities for interconnector trades, and it gives much greater opportunities for all of the generators to trade in different time frames, from day ahead right through to real time.
But Chair, I think it's only a matter of time where I believe you will see a situation where a third party enters into a private PPA with a developer of a renewables project. I think we're just a bit behind. It's a very advanced market and well ahead in the United States. But you have some of the same companies here in Ireland, and we would be conscious this is an emerging market, and it's only a matter of time before such a contract ultimately emerges. But it doesn't solve. I think it's complementary to a very robust state-driven policy that's driving renewables across a range of technology. It'll provide an appropriate complement, but it's not an alternative.
And in relation to who pays then for the additional renewable energy required by that data centre, how would that work? Who would pay for that additional energy required?
The demand centre, the data centre, has to pay for its own energy in the same way as any other commercial organisation.
The infrastructure, Chair,
Yeah, the infrastructure.
Of the infrastructure. Well, there is a connection policy, so they would pay a contribution for the impact it has on the wider network, but they pay for the direct connection to the network.
In relation to the rural grid, then, our capability in handling.
Yeah, when you talk about the rural grid, that suggests to me smaller scale generation connecting to the ESB network's distribution network. We're responsible for the grid, if you like, the motorways of the grid network, which have the capability of transmitting, large quantities of electricity. So we have to take the total impact on the distribution system from ESB networks and then reflect that in any infrastructure investment that's required on the transmission system. So we have been doing that as, for example, small-scale wind has been connected to the distribution system.
Like microgeneration you're talking about here?
All of those impacts have got to be taken into account in how we design and future-proof our transmission system.
Okay, thank you. I might just move on and we could come in. I'm going to bring in Deputy Stanley. Yeah, thank you.
And just welcome Valerie and Mark and Robin. I have a few brief questions just around, what's happened to date in terms of AirGrid, making changes to the grid for the future in terms of, that we know that there's potential there for up to 75% of intermittent power to the grid. And at times we've gone as high, we've gone over 60%, I understand, and as low as 4% on a couple of days during the summer. But obviously we weren't using much, and that would tell me that solar isn't kicking in. The fact that only 4% or 5% was used on certain days. But the question around that I want to ask, I suppose, is in terms of trying to cater for microgeneration, if we had a lot of small companies or even private individuals or farmers, businesses, supplying small-scale generation to the grid in the morning, would the grid be able to cope with it? And what's the major blocks to that happening? Because other countries, while we don't have huge amounts of sunshine, but we have significant, we don't seem to be as far on as other countries with that. The other question, one of the other questions is in relation to electric vehicles. How much of a change will this require? It's related to the first one in relation to changing the grid, because if we had a lot of people, plugging into, home charging or whatever, would the grid be able to cope? And that's related to the first question in terms of, the demand that would put onto the grid. Has AirGrid done anything in relation to microgrids? Because, we've one large grid, and I can see the logic of that. But, are there any plans to develop microgrids, maybe in a small area where it would make sense to generate and use the power within that particular area? And the last question I have is just in relation to base load and dispatchable power. A lot of our sources of energy are going to be from intermittent, wind, solar. And there's a concern there, a real concern in terms of wind down and start-up costs, for power plants and the intermittent nature and the grid overheating and then not having enough, and with a growing population, the demands are going to be there. Just in terms of that, what plans have you in place, to use other sources, such as biogas and also hydro? We know hydro won't provide, at one time it provided all the electricity we ever needed in the 1920s, but we're not in the 1920s, and Northern Crucial doesn't do it any longer. But we do have a large number of small sources of hydropower, potentially that could be used. And again, it's something that would seem to be very underdeveloped in this country, which would add to a kind of that base load that we need to be, to have a secure source of power when wind and sun isn't there.
Thank you. You can answer them in any order.
Maybe I'll take that on. Lots of questions there. You did allude to the challenge of operating a system with renewable energy. We have We've described the progress that we've made operating on a system with a lot of onshore wind, which is intermittent. So we try to forecast it as best we can, and then we try to run the system on the back of that. But there will be days when there is little wind. There will be some days where there's record amounts of wind, namely last Friday, which was a day where we had a new record of wind on the system. That has been a significant technical challenge for us, and the benefit of that is that the more wind that we can accommodate in the system, the better the prices of electricity, and the more we benefit from the decarbonisation impacts of that. So in terms of the journey we've been on, we think we've made great strides in that, and the 40% target in 2020 is achievable. And for us, the challenge is to move the instantaneous level of renewables from the 65% that it's at the moment to 75% in 2020. The benefit of that is that if we achieve that 75%, then there is less curtailment of all the wind that's connected. So there are times when we actually have to ask those wind generators to generate less, because the system wouldn't remain stable if we didn't do that. So that's the journey that we're on. You're quite right to recognise the fact that there is lots of change ahead, and one of the ways that we have tried to assess that is to introduce what we call our tomorrow's energy scenarios. They are to engage with society at large, with lots of our stakeholders, to try and understand how people see the future. So is it going to be much of what we've had before, or is there going to be a huge amount of customer action? So you've talked about a lot of different changes that could impact how we manage the grid. You've talked about microgeneration. So microgeneration would impact it effectively. From our perspective, we wouldn't see as much demand. There could be more solar, there could be more electric vehicles, and we have tried to set out 4 different scenarios that start to explain what the impact on our business and on the grid would be, and that is expected to be an ongoing discussion. It's expected to be an ongoing opportunity for policymakers to understand what the future may look like, and it gives us an opportunity to sit back and look and say, well, what is the impact on the grid of all of those different scenarios? So that is what we're doing at the moment, and we're developing plans for those scenarios so we understand what the impact on infrastructure is.
Is that in relation to microgeneration? Is it?
And the area of dispatchable power as well.
Yeah.
In terms of microgeneration, that is where customers themselves take action. They invest in generation, batteries, solar panels, whatever it is, and almost become isolated from the grid. So the effect of that is to...
What I'm referring to there is microgeneration and feeding into the grid.
Back into the grid. It's one of the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly that the private citizen, could sell back onto the grid, and the impact that would have from air grid.
So they have to then produce more energy than they're using. And yes, there is some work that needs to be done in terms of how they're rewarded for bringing generation back onto the grid, or bringing energy back onto the grid. The bulk of the issue there is on the distribution network in terms of how it impacts on the lines that are already there connecting to a house, because the distribution system is designed as a radial feed, and if you have energy coming back up the pipe, then there are things that need to be done to that network to manage that. But from our perspective, it has less impact on our system, because we are used to dealing with significant amounts of generation on the system, as opposed to, if you like, the marginal changes that microgeneration would bring.
And just the base load and dispatchable power, what plans do you have in place to to bring on new sources, because given the fact that a lot of our power will be generated by wind and sun, in other words, intermittent sources, what plans have you in terms of, having more secure sources there as a backup for dispatchable power that will provide, power when those other sources aren't readily available? We won't always have last Friday, and it's good when we have last Friday, because obviously, for the reasons you just stated, where wind done the business for us, but there will be days when wind won't do it, and we might have too much sun. Okay, we might have high demand.
That's a very, very good question.
Particularly in frosty weather, big freeze.
There are three ways in which generators can get a revenue in this market. The first one is what's called a capacity payment. So if you can be relied upon to be there when you're needed, so on a day when there's very little wind, the large conventional generators are rewarded for being there. They get a capacity payment. That's one revenue stream. They can gain revenue by being involved in the energy market, which we have described as ISEM, and they can also earn revenue from what we describe as system services. So the services that they can provide to help us run the system when there's lots of wind on the system. So if the wind suddenly dies, and you need the conventional generators to step up and fill the gap, then we will reward the generators for being able to generate more quickly than they traditionally have been able to do. So there's a range of ways of supporting the conventional generation that we need. The regulator and ourselves run a capacity auction, which sets out what the forecast demand in the future is, and all of the generators are able to bid into that capacity auction to claim their portion of that capacity revenue.
I want to go back to the microgeneration point just to get more clarity around it, because we had ESB in last week who said this would be more an issue for EirGrid, if I recollect correctly. And just, I suppose, the challenges and the timelines around that. The EU Renewable Energy Directive is going to introduce entitlements to generate, store and sell renewable electricity for renewable self-consumers in Ireland. So I suppose it's important for us as a committee to understand the challenges for that and the timeline with regard to ensuring that the grid is ready for all of this all these incoming requirements under that directive. And maybe I'm incorrect there, and I stand corrected in relation to ESB saying it will be a matter that maybe we could discuss with EirGrid, but just we need to understand why we have you here, if there are challenges, what they are, so we as a committee can address them in relation to microgeneration, as it was a key recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly.
Okay. And one of the scenarios that we have included in those tomorrow's energy scenarios is a customer action scenario, where we try to capture a lot of what you have described in terms of microgeneration, in terms of sort of solar panels on individual houses, etc. And we've got the detail of the breakdown of that, and we will be looking at what the impact on the grid of all of those changes is.
Mobile phone, or maybe something that maybe should be on flight mode. I'm just conscious of the broadcasting. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
So the tomorrow's energy scenarios is designed to capture the direction of travel that has been described by microgeneration, where individuals start to take more action than they have at the moment. So we're all conscious of our smartphones and the apps that we have that allow us to control our central heating, etc. And if that is developed further, and if people install batteries, install solar panels, install heat pumps, all of those are reflected in the tomorrow's energy scenarios. In the consumer action piece, we have got 560,000 electric vehicles, to give you an example. We have got 1,500 megawatts of solar, quite a lot of that being local individual solar panels.
And the grid, is it ready for that? Are we prepared for that in relation to microgeneration? Are we ready, or what's the timeline in relation to?
Well, that's the engagement that we've had, is to try to understand the rate at which some of those actions will take place.
If I may help with this, Chair, I think in the context of you take electric vehicles, where the house is going to be consuming power, we have a very clear handle on that, because what's our business? Our business is getting power through the transmission system down. Nobody yet has come up with an articulation of a technical, regulatory and pricing solution for the consumer to send power the other way. That there is no solution currently on the table. There's a lot of discussions going on. The ESB have a significant role to play in that, and ultimately it comes back to us. So that remains very unclear. No technical, no regulatory and no pricing offer yet. But when it comes to consuming at a consumer level, such as EVs, we've very much taken account of it in terms of what the future demand scenario might be. So I think I'm aware there's a Citizens Assembly recommendation. There's work to be done jointly by ourselves, ESB and others, and that's something we're talking to the ESB about.
Okay, Senator Marshall.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, everyone, for your presentation. I suppose really just 3 points I'd like a bit of clarity on. And there's been a lot of reference to microgeneration here. Speaking to some of our counterparts in Europe and speaking to businesses who are involved in microgeneration, where you have a business with a high electricity demand and the ability to generate that, there is an appetite for an adjacent business to be able to share that or use that or trade that between those businesses. Is that very much something that's very far in the future, that something that you couldn't consider at the moment? Or is it something that we'll be able to deliver in the short to medium term, where businesses, adjacent businesses, could trade, use the grid effectively to shift the energy and the electricity between the businesses and trade that? The second question, I'd just like a bit of clarity on, when we look at success of renewables in Europe, most of the success, or a lot of the success, is attributed to the fact that it's very much a community initiative. Is there an ability or a mechanism where a community initiative to generate renewable energy could be shared using the grid and utilising the grid to get that back to members of the community? And I suppose the final point, and you've touched on it briefly, was the investment and specifically the smart technology. So as much as we can produce more renewable electricity, we probably, in my opinion, need to look at more investment in being more efficient in how we use it, and a capacity or an ability to store that and access it at times that we need it. So, because obviously the variability or the intermittent nature of renewables, is there enough investment done in that area at the moment, and a strategic approach to it on a national level?
Okay, I'll take back to the microgeneration. The idea of that you described in terms of one business going into business with another business to trade the energy, those require some changes to the, if you like, the tariffing arrangements that exist at the moment. So we would have to work with the regulator to, if you like, straighten out the issues that are involved with that. But I've heard the argument, and there's merit in trying to solve that. And again, in the main, that tends to be at a local distribution level to be solved. In terms of the community initiatives, I think the department in their RES proposals have recognised the benefit of community engagement in renewable energy, and we will be working with them in terms of working through a proposal to have auctions for, if you like, the next tranche of renewable energy. And certainly they've made it very clear that they would be looking to have community initiatives built into that proposal. So some of the concerns that you've aired should be addressed in that process. In terms of investment in smart technology, I think there's a lot of investment or potential investment by customers that we've talked about. I think we, as a business, have invested in quite a lot of innovation in terms of how we have arrived at being able to manage the grid with the 65% at the moment and 75% by 2020. And we do constantly look for opportunities to innovate, particularly in the area of infrastructure. Clearly, building infrastructure for a grid company is a challenge. We've talked about the work that we've done to try to engage much more upfront with communities to explain what the various options are and bring those options to the table and encourage discussion around that. But we also look to find mechanisms for reducing the amount of infrastructure build that we need to do. So there are good examples of infrastructure projects at the moment which are deferring infrastructure investment and are making better use of the infrastructure that's already in place.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Senator Mulhern.
Thanks. Microgeneration. I just have a couple of questions also because, as you said, it's key here, and I'm not clear on a couple of points. It sounds from what you've said that there needs to be, there's no technical framework, regulatory framework, etc. So if we were to proceed right now, you'd be talking about offline microgeneration, so people aren't feeding into the grid. In a situation, you talked, Mr. McCormick, about how you try and anticipate renewables coming online, that in a few days' time, for the next few days, we're going to have wind, and you try and stabilise the network. If somebody is microgenerating, like, how does that work? Do you tell a generator, well, we see for the next few days there's going to be wind, and we're going to need wind from all of you wind farms there? In the case of individuals, like, is that how it's working? That you tell these generators, please be ready, we're going to be taking your capacity on these days? And I suppose I need to know that to ask the next question. Is that how it works, Mr. McCormick, when you're planning?
For generators of some size, we would have a control link to that generator. So the large-scale wind generation, we are able to send a signal to them to say, listen, can you pull back a little bit? You're generating too much in the conditions that we have. We don't have the same control over the small-scale wind farm. So an individual wind turbine in somebody's farm, we don't have any visibility of that. So we have to manage, if you like, the demand that we anticipate. So one of the first things we do is we try to forecast what the demand for the day is. Then we try and forecast what output from wind is going to be. We subtract that from the demand, and then we schedule the large conventional generators, which we might have to give them 10 hours notice to get warmed up and get ready to start.
So this would seem to be a serious issue in relation to microgeneration going into the grid of wind, for example, like this communication piece that whether it's you in control and asking them to ramp up or to, we want or pull back, that you need to be having this conversation with thousands of individuals potentially if everybody started to do this, that there's a limitation in relation to microgeneration on the grid as things stand. Would that be correct?
It's the scale of what they're going to do. So for each residence, if you like, it's unlikely that they're going to have a huge export. So unless everybody was doing it, it's likely that we would be able to manage it without finding a way of managing that control element of it. We've had to do it with small-scale wind, we've had to do it with small-scale solar, and we would have to do it with small-scale export.
Can I ask you on cost? Is it cheaper for a large-scale commercial wind farm per megawatt that it costs, the public service obligation that it costs the energy buyer, the consumer? Is it cheaper to buy renewable wind from a wind farm or from a microgenerator, if you take it that the microgenerator has been supported also under a PSO? Which is a cheaper?
I mean, a large-scale wind farm can produce renewable energy very, very cost-effectively. And the tariffs that have been developed in Europe, places like Portugal and that, to stimulate microgeneration have been very, very high, but that's part of their government's policy. So yeah, I mean, scale gives you, as we know in any business, gives you significant economies and gives you prices that you're just not going to
So potentially it's going to cost us more in microgeneration per megawatt than it will on a commercial large wind farm.
It will certainly come at a higher price, unquestionably about that.
Okay.
But can I just to clarify one thing, Senator? I mean, at this moment in the control room in Ballsbridge, there's people literally balancing supply and demand, from wind farms as small as 10 megawatts right up to big-scale generators. In the near to medium term, even with very significant number of households going to microgeneration, and even if you could export to the grid, it's unlikely in the broader scheme of things, with the amount of demand and volume that EirGrid has to deal with aggregated right back, that it would be very significant or very impacting or disruptive for our operations. You'd have to get to the scale where, and even if hundreds of thousands of houses in Ireland, I mean, the consumption at a domestic level compared with heavy industry and commercial is quite modest. So in terms of back to Robin's scenarios, we don't see microgeneration as presenting a problem of any significance when compared with the demand we've got at the moment. That's ahead of us: population growth, economic growth, and indeed the requirement to build renewables of very significant scale. That's the challenge we're facing. And I understand the desire to get the consumer into the energy system, and I think that's very, 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 very desirable. But the bigger picture we have is we have to get thousands of megawatts of renewables into the Irish system if we're not to see our trajectory going backwards instead of actually accelerating.
Just two more. In the area of storage and wind and sun not shining, etc., is that down to individual generators as to how they might store, or are you involved in storage in any way, or bringing balance onto the system by virtue of storage? Is that part of what you do, or that you might do in the future?
I'll take that one again. Yeah, batteries are obviously an interesting subject, and there is inevitably a lot of interest in how batteries operate. We don't own any kit. We don't own a generator. We don't own a battery. We don't own a wind farm. What we do is we try to manage the consequences of all the technology that are on the system. So back in the day when the support mechanisms were put in place, the response commercially was onshore wind. There hasn't been the same response from the battery storage fraternity, but it's likely that will increase, and there is evidence of much more activity in the storage sector. We have a 10 megawatt battery up in one of the power stations in Northern Ireland, but we don't have any scale batteries connected to the system at the moment. But we expect, just as any other technology can operate on the market, that batteries will start to play a greater place, both at a local level as part of that microgeneration package and at scale on the grid. So a battery can provide some of those services that I talked about and get remunerated for that. It can provide capacity. It can also play a part in managing infrastructure. And the battery people need to get their revenue streams from a number of different places, and it's trying to put that jigsaw of revenue together that is probably delaying some of the battery activity on the system.
I just wanted to ask you also about offshore wind and a comparison between East Coast and West Coast, where obviously there's a way better resource on the West Coast, and cost from the point of view of building out transmission to take, like which in the short term is offshore wind on the Atlantic side, on the western seaboard, is that realisable in the short term in terms of cost? And I know that the cost in terms of the generator, they bear that cost, but in terms of building out transmission, is that going to happen in the short term? There's talk, obviously, in general, of now looking at offshore, or are we really right now just talking about on the East Coast in the Irish Sea?
It's the East Coast. It's closer. It's shallower water, it's cheaper to construct, and it does have very good, what we call capacity factors, which is the level of wind that it can actually generate. The day for the west coast of Ireland will come, I've no doubt about it, but it'll be longer term. It will be longer term, because you've got obviously a much more hostile, I suppose, in terms of ocean environment. You've got to get the power back on the east coast of Ireland is where the power is actually needed, and the east coast of Ireland is where there's relative strength in the grid. So, I mean, we would be quite clear about that. If you want to impact Ireland's 2030 targets, which is where the immediate, I suppose, critical need is, you need to start mobilising offshore activity on the east coast.
Okay, and so I know I said finally, Grid West is gone, and now you're looking at reinforcement of the grid by other means. I wanted to ask you, in relation to grid offers and grid capacity, what's the difference? How many megawatts have yet to be installed but are on offer and need to be met and have a grid offer in that western area? And what shortfall is there in transmission? Right now, if they all came looking for their connection, how much is it something like 400 megawatts? And what's the capacity on the grid to take them? Or before they could all see their place on the grid, are you saying that we would have to have that reinforcement? You know, is there a disparity there between what's offered and what's realisable, and you know what capacity is on transmission there at the moment?
Okay, we can get you the detail of the, if you like, the numbers of the megawatts, but we had to review the Grid West project in light of some reductions in the amount of wind capacity that wanted to connect to the system, and we have come forward with a North Connaught project, which we will be developing, and that matches the foreseeable demand for wind in that area at the moment.
But as I understand it, Senator, now, and please, I have some understanding of Mayo from a previous life. Once Bordnamona connect their wind farm, any wind farm up there, I think you're pretty, there's not much room for anything else up there. That's my understanding. And the Connaught transmission upgrade there is very important to allowing Mayo unlock future capacity for, again, the 2020 to 2030 period. So this is a vital line to give Mayo an opportunity to make a contribution in the next decade.
My real understanding, because I did attend your open day that at different points in Mayo, and my understanding is that this reinforcement, it's not even a line on the map at the moment, because you're afraid to draw a line on the map. It's a concept that needs to be met, and that you'll be talking about several years down the line. And yet there's planning permission for a combined heat and power plant there. So by the sounds of it, when ONINI is commissioned next year, this combined heat and power plant, which is located beside a place where there's planning permission for a data centre, may be in difficulty. Perhaps if you can't answer it, I could get clarity on that point.
I think Valerie's we're in consultation on this particular project, and Valerie can speak to the consultation process, because we're very keen to push this along, be under no illusion.
Particularly about this site, it's what was called a former Asahi site. There's a
Mayo Renewable Power.
Exactly. Yes,
I'm very familiar with it. Yes.
Yeah.
Or
do you feel in relation to the North Connaught project and where that's at, as part of our new process in engaging communities around Ireland about the need to develop the grid, that we have a new 6-step approach where we engage with communities at a much earlier stage. So we have been out in Mayo, and I know you've attended the events, and we've had our mobile unit and our local office there engaging with communities on the need for the project and the revision of the capacity of the line from Grid West to the North Connaught project. And some stakeholders are obviously looking to see where the project is going, but we're not at that stage yet, because we're looking at the connection points and technology options. But in the start of 2019, we'll be moving to that next phase, where we'll be engaging on connection points and routing. So that is to come, but it's not there yet.
Do data centres need connection into transmission, or can distribution systems satisfy them? Or
depends on the size of them. Literally depends on the size.
And all our data centres at the moment in general, is it transmission lines they're connected into, or?
Well, again, it depends on the size. There are data centres which are 5 megawatts, and there are data centres which are 200 megawatts. So it depends on the scale. It's specific.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to bring in Deputy Pringle next.
Thanks, Chair. A few questions. Just if we could start, maybe the centre in Ballsbridge that you've managed electricity from, I've heard that it's very interesting to see it in that there, and I'm wondering maybe if it's something that the committee could go and have a look at it, that it might be something, how to manage renewables and stuff like that there on the grid, and that's maybe something that we could benefit from, if that would be possible. Maybe, Chair.
Good suggestion, Deputy.
Maybe good. Just a couple of questions. The renewable energy scenario in the Pringle report assumes a linear increase in energy market battery capacity from 0 to 1.7 gigawatts installed battery capacity from 2020 to 2030. But the report didn't mention anything in terms of pump storage, water storage, and Ireland has a history of managing those type of installations as well. So I'm just wondering, should that be something that we should explore as well in terms of how to manage capacity on the grid and actually having a large pump storage facility or number of facilities around the country that could actually deal with the renewable energy as well and keep them going, as well as actually managing the grid and the difficulties in the grid. The other thing I was very interested in what you were saying there. You outlined about the offshore wind and about the Irish Sea, and you outlined a number of problems. There's sorry, just get me bearings here. Oh yeah, you talk about the centralised model of offshore wind, and that you would recommend that yourselves would be the people that would manage that in terms of the ongoing connections. That I'm just wondering, have you put that forward to government, and what kind of reception it's getting, and where is that decision to be made? Because I think that's vitally important in terms of moving the offshore wind on, particularly when you look at the amount of offshore wind that's been developed in everywhere except here. And it's down to decision-making processes, I think, the planning process, and also this as well in relation to yourself. So if you'd expand a wee bit more on that. And just lastly, if I could just ask in relation to the West Coast and stuff like that there, how about, or how possible or feasible is DC current in terms of taking the power from a wind farm and then converting it back to AC current and connecting to the grid, and somewhere where that the grid is developed for that, you know, so that you have, rather than having to take the AC connectors out to the West Coast, you can take the DC in to the system and convert it back to AC then. How practical is that, and have you looked at it? Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy.
Okay. You mentioned pump storage, and clearly Turlock Hill is one of the greatest assets we have in the system. Turlock Hill and our Corcoran have served the nation spectacularly well since they were built. The economics of pump storage are very, very difficult, and we occasionally one hears of developers looking at potential projects in different parts of Ireland, but to date we haven't had a developer come to us with a viable proposition. Ultimately, it's a third party will see this as an opportunity, will have a look at what the cost of development would be and look at how they might make money from the development. I think one of the challenges...
Could I just ask, when you talk about viable, you're talking about
financially viable,
the technology is
planning. The technology is proven for 100 years.
Yeah.
The issue is really, could you get planning permission, which is clearly a challenge, and secondly, can you make it economically work? Because clearly the capital costs of large-scale pump storage are very significant. Now, there have been talks of projects over the years, but nothing has really come to light. Clearly, pump storage on the system in significant proportions would be very helpful to the system if it could be done and delivered economically, but there's nothing of substance out there at this point in time. On the offshore wind, we've suggested a centralised model. We've suggested the same to the department. I suppose we're trying to get the conversation going about offshore. There's projects out there in the Irish Sea at the moment with licences, and are those licences robust? Because they were given maybe up as much as 10 years ago. So we're trying to stimulate the debate to get the policy debate going, so that the government can make a decision and give policy direction. And we thought offering a view to stimulate that would be helpful, rather than sitting back and waiting. And pardon?
How are we getting on?
Well, we've just only done it very recently, Deputy. But we feel a responsibility to. Offshore wind is going to take many years to develop. The sooner we have the conversation, the sooner we make some policy decisions, the sooner we resolve some regulatory and licensing issues, the sooner developers will start putting money into projects. So, You know, we're not fixated on the model, but we do think the conversation needs to get going. Your last point was about, were you referring to wind farms or offshore wind farms on DC current?
Offshore wind farms are...
On offshore. I defer to my esteemed expert on the right now if you're going to talk about getting power from an offshore wind farm and talk about DC and AC, Robin.
Well, obviously we do use high voltage direct current applications for our interconnectors. So that technology would be considered along with conventional AC technology, depending on what the circumstances were of an application. So we don't rule it in or rule it out. We consider it as part of whatever the application is, the scale of the application.
Politicians still doing this then.
Well, if you can avoid a DC connection, you will, because it's much more complex and much more expensive. So if you could build an offshore wind farm that was close to the shore and use an underground AC cable, that's what you would do, because it would be faster and it would be less expensive and it would be more reliable. So it's all about the project's context, the unique project context, and you take each on its own merits.
The reality is that on the West Coast we're not going to have the demand, unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, but we have the possibility of generation on the West Coast, but we don't have the demand. So we have to get out to this demand centre, which was on the East Coast, and it's how feasible is it to get there? That's the problem we have.
Correct.
Yeah, I think you're
Deputy. Deputy Fitzmaurice, do you want to go next? Yeah, I think Deputy Ryan is going to wait. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your presentation. Just a few, and look at if maybe the other part of you that should be answered in some of these. You talked about electric cars going into the future, and that in the infrastructure that's required around the country, we're sort of way behind at the moment in when you hear people that has electric cars and trying to get charged here and there. If Ireland moves fast to electric cars with incentives in different places, it appears that we are not fit to keep up with having enough power points for it. The second question is, you talked about extra wind and going 40% and going, I know you talked about 16% and going higher. My understanding is the rock-off and generation from wind, obviously it's wind won't come in at a variable speed, that should be higher or lower. What is the cost to the generation mechanism, to basically the generators, where that wind comes into to basically smooth it out? I'm hearing prices of 700 or 800 million that DSB would have to spend. Is that right? And it's just a question that I'm throwing out to you. Microgeneration, you spoke about that, and I think a lot of the other deputies spoke about it. You were saying it's sort of a case of that there is, yes, to be produced in small amounts, but I can't see it being awful complicated. It's either you give a price for something or you don't. Do you know, that type of way that if it's 13 cent per unit or 20 cent or whatever way it is, you were saying there's no set tariffs or whatever, but can there not be a tariff set fairly easily? In the line of, you spoke about, and correct me if I'm wrong here, my vision of what you're doing is that you're saying to Joe Bloggs here with the electric or with the wind turbine, and the person with the solar and the person with the fossil fuel, we'll need X amount from you and X amount from you and X amount from you. If you keep getting a fair bit of wind and you're telling this guy here with the fossil, well, we don't want you that much now, will he not disappear? Can ye live without the fossil? My understanding is no. Am I correct in saying, and this is from information, that this year is probably, I'm not talking about the numbers of generators or wind turbines, that this year is one of the worst in history for generating wind with the speeds of wind, and the last 4 hours, the last 5 have been pretty bad. And you need, am I correct in saying as well that you will need, be it a gas power plant that will create electricity, or some type of what I would call a second engine on standby, because with the other types, you cannot really rely on it. And the other one then, you spoke about the interconnector going from Ireland to France. And you spoke about exporting electricity to France, from my understanding. They have nuclear, is the understanding I have. Nuclear, I think, is the cheapest form of electricity. Why would they be taking stuff from us? Second of all, we heard a few years ago that we were going to export into England. How much are we exporting to England at the moment of wind? And thirdly, are we going to go down a road, or is there any danger in this, that if we get electricity from France pretty cheap, that we won't be bothered about that? Obviously money talks, and you're going to be, it's a business, and if you get it at a lower rate, that you would be more inclined to take it from there than telling somebody else that would be at a higher rate that I'll take it from you. And am I correct in saying that with the tariff on wind, that what the customer pays and what the person that owns the wind turbine, that they get more per unit than what the customer pays the ESB for the electricity? And how much electricity money's worth do ye dump per year where you've gone into agreements that you have to adhere to under the renewables? Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot there. What I was going to suggest, Robin, I'll pick up. Robin's suggesting I start with EVs because I drive an EV and I know an awful lot about the experience. And look, I mean, and that's, sorry, that's, it might sound joking, but it's true. And look, we don't have a role to play in this, very, very simply. But I am noticing, just as a consumer, lots of private companies are starting to put, if you can tell to your little, you can charge your electric car vehicle. So I do think the momentum's starting to build, just as a consumer. I speak as a consumer now, not as the CEO of Air. And microgeneration, I know it's come up again, just to be really, I know it sounds simple, Deputy Fitzmaurice, but just to be really clear, you do need a policy framework, you need a technical way in which power can go from home to grid, you need proper regulation, re-tariff. We have none of that here at the moment. We have a very limited role to play in that, and I'm not ducking the question, but that's the reality of where we are at the moment. So I just wanted to close that one off. You talked about living without fossil fuels. Will be here. They're not going away off, disappearing, but they will exist into the future at a very low level on the system, because renewables will be the dominant source of generation, and then the kind of technology and the services that have been developed by EirGrid will allow fossils to operate at levels of very low levels of operation to provide system stability never previously dreamt of. And as long as the market provides appropriate remuneration for them to be there and to provide that service, then we've nothing to fear from a security of supply perspective. So we're very confident we have a very, very good handle on that. And working with the regulator and looking at supply demand going forward, I think this committee has nothing to fear from renewables going up and fossils going down, because we will manage the balance through our engineering capability. You mentioned interconnection with France. I mean, the modelling around the interconnector between Ireland and France. France has challenges in Brittany, in northern France. France has challenges with, it's going to wind out some of the nuclear. It needs renewables. We're a very attractive source of renewables for France through that interconnector. And all our modelling suggests that power will go more often Ireland to France than France to Ireland, but it will come from France to Ireland at times, but the dominant electron flow will be from France to England, and we both have developed a model that says the same, and that's vital for us, because if we ratchet up our renewables and then find ourselves at times during the day where there's nowhere to deploy it, then the economics of those projects get challenged, and they won't get built. Developers will not build these projects if they think 20% of the time they're going to be turned off and make no money. But if they know they can ship it off to France, then it works for all of us. And then you mentioned the cost about the wind. I mean, you asked a question about wind cost and what developers are being paid.
Yeah.
I mean, what
I'm saying is there is talk that between subsidy, that it works out like 20 cents a unit where the supplier...
I think if you look up the regulator's website, this is public domain information, what a wind farm developer gets paid under refit, which is the previous incentive mechanism, is a matter of public knowledge. And it's nothing like the numbers. It's certainly significantly below what a consumer is paying for electricity. So that's all public domain information. So now there was, Robin, there was a question on rock-off and cross-generators.
Yeah, part of the journey that we've been on to get to being able to cope with more and more wind in the system is we've had to go back to the conventional generators, and we've had to ask them to change the way they run a little bit, and we've gone through a process of getting them to change the setting on a rock-off as a rate of change of frequency. So it's to protect that generator from sitting in its own little island and the frequency changing and damaging the plant. So we've been working with them to change their setting so that if there is an event on the system, we don't lose all the generators when we don't need to. So we want to keep them on the system, even though there's a bit of change of
involved in all of that. If you're going to, we'll say 80% wind or whatever.
Well, there's little cost in changing the rate of change of frequency setting. The generators, I don't know specifically how much a generator has to pay to get the rate of change of frequency relay changed to the new setting. But in doing so, it facilitates the renewable generation that we have on the system, and it helps to support the stream of system services rewards that they get for behaving in a manner that they need to keep our system stable.
And may I just say, if you look at the direction of travel, we've had the single electricity market, we now have the integrated single electricity market, you know, between generators being rewarded for trading their electricity, ancillary services or capacity payments. The overall pot and the cost of running the market is going down. It's not going up, it's going down. The direction of travel. It's becoming more competitive, and renewables, because the marginal cost is zero, because there are no fuel costs, is actually driving the cost down. It might be moving into slightly different buckets, but the price is going down overall of running the market. I think and there was one comment, there was one other comment you asked, Deputy, which was about the UK and what's happening in the interconnector east-west. Robin, you might just make a comment on the flows on that.
Yes. Well, the benefit of this integrated single electricity market, which commenced on the 1st of October of this year, is that the flows of energy on the interconnectors are much more competitive than they were previously. The arrangements previously couldn't guarantee that the trades were economic. And in addition to that, the trades across the interconnector are now done on a pan-European basis. So someone who wants to trade on interconnectors can trade on a number of interconnectors across Europe. And the evidence is that the trades on the interconnector are efficient. So there are times when the forecast is for lots of wind, then you will see a high export on the two interconnectors from the island to GB.
What about when I asked you about the amount of wind this year, have you the stats on that?
Oh. The amount of wind.
Is this a good or a bad year for the wind community?
I'm not talking about it, but my understanding is that this year has been second worst in history for. I'm talking about the numbers of turbines.
Yeah, for wind farms in general. Yeah, we don't have that data, Deputy. Okay. Anecdotally, I've heard references to that, but I haven't seen any data.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. I just have one little question in relation to the gate system and how that works in relation to connecting new projects, and just how that works, and in relation to connecting them in order of their strategic importance. If you could just expand on how EirGrid does that, and I suppose that time, because I know you talk about the bigger projects rather than microgeneration and reaching our 2020 targets, and are you confident that we will connect all of those who are now currently in the queue by 2020? if you could expand on how it works and reaching the 2020 targets.
The direction of travel for 2020 looks very positive, in the sense that under the old Gate 3 process, most of the developers in question have their connection offers from us. They've signed their contracts, they've done their EPC procurement, and it looks like the direction of travel is good for 2020. To get us into the next world, which is 2020 to 2030, under government policy, the regulator has launched a process called ECP1, Enduring Connection Policy 1, and that's allowing the next batch of projects, both onshore wind, solar and battery, and has asked us to process those connections. So we have a very intensive process going on at the moment to do connection offers for onshore wind, for solar and for battery, which will allow those projects in due course to compete in the first generation of new support, next support scheme, which of course will be auctions. So there's a pipeline there of over 1,000 megawatts, which people are actively working on, and we expect many of those will compete at the first auction when that is announced in the next year or two.
And is there scope for a better kind of categorisation in relation to that queuing system of getting?
Yeah, I believe the next policy beyond DCP1, which we would, is a bridge between the old and maybe the future. I think there may very well be a case for a policy or a category that's specific, for example, to offshore, because it's quite different. So I think that will come into the mindset of both the policymakers and the regulators. And in any consultation they have with us, we would be maybe inclined to sort of suggest that you create a category that's very efficient and fit for purpose for that particular grouping of technologies.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring in finally Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Yeah, just on that one, we should also try and coordinate grid and planning. There's still been a lot of difficulties in the timelines. But I was thinking when you spoke earlier, Mr. Foley, there was a predecessor of yours, fairly distant, but remember him in one of these rooms telling me that the maximum amount of renewable power we would ever get in the system was 800 megawatts. After that, it was highly dangerous. Don't go near it. And as you said in your presentation, here we are with 5,000 gigawatt interconnected. I read this morning with interest the World Energy Outlook on where the world is going. And it was interesting, where they were seeing where the world needs to go is actually where you are, in terms of the level of capability of variables, renewables, integration, this electrification of everything, the prospects ahead of us. On the record, it gives me great pleasure to say I think your company, the men and women of EirGrid, have been climate heroes. I think you've done really important, significant, internationally significant work on this, the very centre of the industrial revolution, the clean industrial revolution that's taking place. And the exciting thing is we're only starting. The exciting thing is actually you need to go from here confident in your abilities and in our abilities as a country to do it. And your company is one of the few examples where we can truly say that, where we are world leaders, and it's not in an insignificant area. What the World Energy Outlook said today, that what you're doing is the key to this success in decarbonising our energy system, and that's why you're heroes. If there was a legion of on air in our country, whatever, I'd stick it on the breast of every single EirGrid executive and worker. And that's from someone who's always haranguing people here, so it's a good opportunity. But with that spirit of can-do and going from here, and I'm very glad to hear you saying that, the aim, the target now, the instantaneous interconnection of 75%. David Connolly and others of the Irish Wind Energy Association last month presented a paper where they were showing for 2030 we should aim for an average renewables interconnect a rate of 70%, using the mix of the sort of offshore you're talking about, solar, onshore, storage and other capabilities. Do you think, whatever about the 75% instantaneous capability, can you do the 70% average by 2030?
I could be shocked by my colleagues for answering this question. Look, I think I'm really comforted by the fact that the EU, under the Horizon 20 programme, has put 20 million into this, the EU Sysflex programme. If 20 million can't deliver the next quantum beyond, from 75 up to 85 to 90, then I'll be bitterly disappointed. I mean, the money is there, the will is there, the pan-European commitment is there. We're butting up against the laws of physics here. So, I mean, we're really, and every next increment becomes harder and becomes more expensive. But I think Sysflex is going to throw up some real further shifts in terms of what we can do. And it won't be from lack of resolve or commitment or passion around this, Deputy Ryan. We're certainly going to go for it.
And I think we're only starting this revolution. The real start, the dance is only starting in terms of that integration with variable demand. It's the demand side and the variability on it which gives us, which has overcome the inertia, system inertia and other difficulties, the physics is we recognise a real challenge. In terms of the Irish Sea, let's say we're commissioning by 2030 to build 5 gigawatts of offshore wind, which we should do. We've been thinking about this for 10 years. And it's interesting you cite TNET and Energinet, the Dutch and Danish TSOs. What's the strategy for, in your mind, in that 5 gigawatts? Do you bring it all back ashore to Ireland and then ship it off with interconnection to the UK and France, or does some of it head east initially? Do you look at using the? I mean, people have been looking at the idea of the Isle of Man as a collection point where you might have a DC connector. People have been looking at the idea of the Scottish bootstrap coming down, connecting into this Irish Sea. Have we finalised? I know.
We haven't finalised, Deputy. I think you're probably ahead of us a little bit at the moment. I think the near-term emphasis is, can we get a couple of big offshore wind farms connected, but in the context where we can expand in a rational, cost-effective and optional way, not dissimilar to what you just said there. In other words, meet Ireland's needs first. Ireland needs thousands of megawatts between now and 2030 if we're to get anywhere near achieving our targets. So firstly, concentrate on getting it to deal with the Irish issue, but do it and plan it in a way where we may have flexibility down the tracks. I think that's where the smart money is.
I agree with you. We need to ship hard to Dublin particularly, but the North Sea's Offshore Grid Initiative has been running for 10 years, and it has been. We did that Isles project 10 years ago, looking at this very issue. It's not as if we haven't been thinking about this, and I think the likes of that Green Link interconnector going in, if we built that interconnector and then we found out 10 years later that it wasn't actually designed in an integrated way with the rest of what we're doing in the Irish Sea, we'd be kicking ourselves. It makes sense to think strategically about this, and we have to proceed quickly, because doing this by 2030 won't be that easy. But I would argue that Isles project work, the North Sea's Offshore Grid Initiative, the NSOE 10-year plans, it's not as if there hasn't been thinking. And I would prefer to do it in a coordinated way, even if it takes a year or two longer, to give us that time to get that coordination in place.
Look, we're not in dispute there. You've used the operative word strategic. It has to be strategic, and that's why we've suggested it be planned centrally, because you can't go offshore and start just connecting in an ad hoc manner.
Like, for example, that Green Link interconnector can't possibly be done in the old UK merchant line way, where it just comes into the Irish system and doesn't give us flexibility in terms of reducing curtailment and constraint. In my mind, their facility has to be under your control if we are going to have this Danish and Dutch model that you say. It's that level of strategic thinking we need pretty much to give to indicate to that company straight away that's the way we're going to do it, in my mind.
Okay.
And secondly, I'd go on that. I would look at the Danish operator as a really good example, Energinet, of how you do the modelling on interconnection to show the social gains, and also the fact that they can effectively borrow as the state. They borrow as a state facility, effectively getting 10-year money for next to nothing. You should be doing the same, in my mind, and owning the assets down the line. I think Eirgod should be building up its asset space as we do this task in the same way that the Dutch, well, no, particularly the Danish TSO does. Can I ask again, just if I can go to the West Coast and thinking big, because we do have to think about post-2030, and in my mind, if we're serious about where we're going and this revolution is really going to work for North West Europe, we have a responsibility as a member of the North West Europe energy market to put 15 gigawatts of offshore wind. You could do 5 gigawatts in the North West, 5 in the West and 5 in the South West. And using HVDC cable technology, ship that obviously through Ireland, but maybe around Ireland, into the rest of the North West European electricity market. I mean, as part of our job as a committee is to kind of put forward ideas and what we're thinking of doing. I'm very keen that we do present that idea of a 15 gigawatt offshore facility, because it's the answer to those questions who would say, why aren't we doing oil and gas exploration off the West Coast? Because as far as I can see, the floating technology is now here, the HVDC cable technology is here. What the Chinese are doing with their Belt and Road, I don't know if you've looked what they're doing on HVDC long-distance power distribution. It's fantastic. I mean, they're way ahead of us. They're really thinking big in the revolution, as is California. So we as one of the leaders in the world, we as on the very cutting edge of what's happening, why would we not go 15 gigawatts now, say that's our intention, and start planning now the transmission grid, which is the key thing to get it right, and designing that routing, whether it's offshore around the island or whether it's across the island underground. Have you started looking at that?
Well, we've been involved in the groups that have been looking at it. I think there are probably a number of issues. It's the phasing of it. It's the requirement not for it just to be an Ireland issue. It's got to be a European issue. And it's the trick, I think, in this is to collaborate with partners in Europe to be able to deliver something like that. There's no point in one party doing it. It's got to be done.
I agree fully, and these sort of developments, I'm talking to people who've been involved in this in Europe, and it's starting to happen now in the North Sea and other places. They deal in 5 gigawatt chunks. Like what I'm hearing might sound kind of outlandishly brave or big or ambitious. It's not. This is the way it's going to be built. And if we're not in the game, what I hear from Brussels and Europe is they're dying for us to come. They're waiting to fund this through the Connecting Europe facility. Andrew McDougall is here regular basis crying. He doesn't have any counterparties to lend to. He's dying to lend to this sort of project. If you do it under the NCOE plan, I think if you went with them now, you'd get it into the next NCOE 10-year plan. You'd get funding Connecting Europe facility backed by EIB. I know developers, I could give you the phone numbers, they'd do it tomorrow. And they wouldn't do it tomorrow. This is going to take 15, 20 years. But if we don't start now, we won't get it in 15, 20 years' time, and we should be getting it in 15 years' time. Can I ask another question much more closer to home and back to real reality? What's happening with the North-South Interconnector?
The project, we're awaiting an adjudication from the Supreme Court in Ireland, and that we're hoping will come through before Christmas or early in the new year. And hopefully that will bring an end to judicial process in respect of the project. Vitally needed, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the next decade. And in Northern Ireland, the project is somewhat ensnared in the matter around civil servants having approval or otherwise to actually consent major projects. We welcome...
Westminster 2 weeks ago cleared that hurdle.
It's difficult to give an emphatic response to that, Deputy. We are hopeful it will unlock a number of projects in Northern Ireland, including our own. But it remains to be seen, so it's too early to call.
Are the discussions which are happening in Brussels today, where it seems the European Union within the Brexit negotiations is making it clear that in any backstop arrangement or in terms of regulatory alignment in any review, that consistent application of the energy and climate and environmental rules, particularly in relation to the all-Ireland electricity market, are going to be a sine qua non for any agreement. Do you see that providing any obstacles? Is there any sense in your work with Sony or indeed with the all-Ireland electricity market that that is now threatened, or is that stopping any further progress of the work you're doing? Or is there anything we should be aware of? That
taken a view, rightly or wrongly, and we are comforted by statements by Leo Varadkar and Taoiseach Taoiseach, Arlene Foster and Theresa May. Everybody's saying the same thing, that the all-Ireland electricity market is compelling and it shouldn't be interfered with in a Brexit context. And we remain hopeful that that's going to be the case. Now, the Brexit story changes, as we know, Deputy Ryan. Every day we're hearing different stories. We're trying not to react on a day-to-day basis, but all of our advocacy, we had Greg Clark from Bays over in Sony on the 6th of August on a fact-finding mission. We had him in the control room in Castlereagh. We explained how the market works, how absolutely integrated it is. And the process to disaggregate that in itself is a massive project in its own right. So we remain hopeful and that sanity will prevail here and that this isn't going to be messed around with.
Our engineers saying recently that we will not be able to do on the south what we have to do if we try and do it on a 26-county basis. We need to work this on an all-Ireland basis.
Very disruptive to break that link. Very disruptive, very costly, very damaging to the decarbonisation ambition, because enormous benefits have arisen through the integration that's taken place over the last decade.
Last question I have, and I said the key to this new evolving market is this dance between variable supply and variable demand. And one of the things I was really encouraged with recently at some conference, rather, I think an air-grid engineer said that you now had about 150, or this is 2 years ago, so it may have changed, 150 megawatts of industrial demand that you could switch on and off as part of that. Where's that figure now? How much do we have as balancing? Sorry, and I have one other question after that. Sorry. Yeah. Is that a...
It's much more than that. I think the capacity auction, I don't have an exact figure, I can furnish you with that, but there is much more activity in the demand side unit area in the market, and we have had to call that particular technology into action on occasions. So it is an active player in the market.
Last question I have, I think Michael Liebrick over in the UK makes a valid point that there's still a real challenge in this renewable revolution that's taking place of how in a high-pressure anticyclone environment in the middle of winter, like the likes of last January, we might have a 2 or 3 week period without wind. Obviously solar is not a kicker. Have you started to think about how, as we get up to these very high levels of penetration, is that interconnected to France? Are we in those circumstances? Would it be French nuclear keeps us going, or what? How do you have answer to his question as to how you provide that load in an anticyclone in the coldest part of winter?
The capacity arrangements, so the capacity revenue mechanism that's in place, and the auction process defines how much capacity you need to be able to run a secure system. So you're actually asking for bids in up to the number of megawatts that you need to secure the system, and that should deliver the amount of...
In this new dance, capacity payments are very old school and very much shunned by people who think this is where we're going. Why wouldn't you rely on interconnection rather than capacity payments as a way of meeting that need?
Take into account each of the different technologies. You would give wind a very small credit for being there when you need it. You give conventional plant a greater credit depending on what their outage regime is, how often they're forced out, what their planned outage rate is. And for interconnectors, you give the interconnector a credit, and then you subtract that off the demand that you need to meet. So you are taking into account
capacity for big base loads to be sitting there.
It's all the elements of capacity. And the modelling around this is very sophisticated, and we have a very, very good handle on this. And if the environment, it moves, then our models can respond in terms of the predictive models around what's needed to support the system in that context.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your engagement today. I know it was a long session, but very worthwhile. And if there's no other business, the meeting is adjourned until tomorrow, the 14th of November at 2 p.m. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.